The Ghost Train on Christmas Day. It was Christmas Eve, and I was late for my flight. The snow was falling heavier than usual, and the slippery roads turned my usual route to the airport into a nightmare. I had to catch the last train out of town to make it to my flight. Otherwise, I'd be stuck until morning. I arrived at the station just in time to catch the train, which seemed unusually empty for such a busy night. It was an old model, not the kind of train I usually saw at this station. But I didn't have time to think about it. I hurried aboard. As I stepped onto the train, I noticed the conductor. He wasn't the usual friendly face I was accustomed to on my daily commutes. This man was older, gaunt, with tired eyes that made me uneasy. His uniform was dark and worn, as though it hadn't been cleaned in years. The inside of the train was just as strange, filled with the scent of old wood and something faintly musty lingering in the air. The train car was nearly empty, save for a few scattered passengers, but the atmosphere was tense, as if something wasn't quite right. I sat by the window, watching the snow fall heavier, blanketing everything outside. The train began to move, and I felt it sway slightly as it picked up speed out of the city. Then I heard the sound of a child crying, just a faint sob. At first, I thought I imagined it, but then it echoed faintly again, as if coming from somewhere near the back of the train. I tried to ignore it, but it echoed in my mind. I began to feel increasingly uneasy, glancing around again, but no one else seemed to notice the sound, which only made it worse. Then I saw him, the conductor. I asked him if he heard it. He said, "Not all passengers on this train want to be here, but they cannot leave." To my bewilderment, he walked away immediately. I steadied myself and turned to ask him about what he had just said. But strangely, he was no longer there. I stood up and walked toward the back of the train. My footsteps echoed in the silence. When I reached the next car, I froze in place. In the dim light, I could see a shadow. It was a child. He clutched a small, tattered doll in his hands, wearing what looked like outdated, shabby clothes. He didn't move, his head bowed. I asked, "Are you lost?" But there was no response. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the train lurched forward, shaking violently. Without thinking, I reached out to steady the boy. The lights stabilized, but the train car was empty, completely deserted. I moved back into the aisle, trying to understand what was happening. The other passengers remained still, staring straight ahead, oblivious to the madness unfolding around them. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand grasp my arm, sending a shiver through me. The train shook violently again, and the temperature plummeted. I could see my breath in the air. The train screeched to a sudden halt, and I stumbled, trying to steady myself. The passengers were gone. The train was empty, except for the boy, standing with his back to me. He didn't move, just stood there with his head slightly tilted, as if waiting for me to do something. The doll in the boy's hand fell to the floor. I slowly approached him, bending instinctively to pick it up. When I looked up, my breath caught in my throat. The boy turned, and his eyes were voids of pitch-black emptiness, locking onto mine. His voice echoed coldly in the air. "They left me." I panicked, never having seen anything like this before. Before I could react, the sound of crying turned into an ear-piercing scream, deafening and spine-chilling. I lost my balance and fell backward in fear, my vision spinning as the boy stood still, seemingly unaffected. The train doors suddenly slid open. With trembling hands, I crawled toward the exit, desperately trying to escape. I staggered out into the freezing, eerily silent night. But when I looked back, the train was gone, completely vanished, leaving only an empty, snow-covered platform as if it had never been there. I don't remember how I got home that night. Every Christmas Eve since, I still wonder whether the midnight train was real or just a nightmare. Years later, on another Christmas Eve, I found an old article, a newspaper archive about a train that disappeared in a snowstorm many years ago. The article spoke of a missing child whose parents had abandoned him on that very train. It was said that the Midnight Express appears every Christmas Eve, carrying lost souls who cannot move on. I closed my laptop, my hands trembling. I looked out the window. The snow continued to fall outside, and a chill ran down my spine. The price of the silent one. I glanced at the clock. It was past midnight. I thought it was time to head home. I left the lab late one evening after a long day of experiments. The night was dark, the streets deserted, and the cold air biting at anyone daring to venture out. The road was empty, and the only sound was the distant howl of the wind. As I drove, I suddenly noticed something moving by the roadside. A figure, a girl, walking alone in the desolation. She seemed disoriented, wearing a red coat, her head bowed, and her posture rigid, standing out under the dim light. Something about her felt off, so I slowed my car and came to a stop. I asked her if she was okay. "Do you need a ride?" The girl didn't reply. She kept walking, her steps slow, as if she didn't even notice my presence. Finally, the girl stopped, and she slowly turned around. She had a beautiful face, but her skin was deathly pale, with an expression of anguish, as if she had forgotten how to smile forever. She asked for a ride and said she was on her way home. I politely hesitated at first, but then I agreed to give her a ride. I drove along the dark road as the girl sat silently in the back, staring out of the window. As I drove through the town, approaching an old cemetery, the girl's behavior suddenly shifted. She began to grow increasingly agitated. Suddenly, she started clawing at the car window with her nails, screaming hysterically as if she were desperate to escape. She shouted, "Let me out! Let me out!" Panicked and unsure what was happening, I scrambled to unlock the door. She flung the car door open and bolted towards the cemetery. Her speed was unnatural, almost too fast, disappearing into the night. I got out of the car, calling after her, but she was gone, leaving me standing alone in the eerie silence of the darkness. Confused, I drove away, chalking the incident up as nothing more than a strange encounter. A few nights later, I drove home along the same route, but every night, something strange and puzzling happened. I encountered her again, asking for a ride. Each time as we neared the cemetery, she would scream, louder than before, and run into the darkness. It was like a looped tape, ending in terror every single time. My curiosity grew, and I began to wonder if I was witnessing something from another world. After 4 consecutive nights of experiencing the same bizarre encounter, I couldn't ignore her strange, repetitive behavior anymore. I was haunted by thoughts of what might be happening at the cemetery, and the image of her running remained etched in my mind. The next day, I decided to visit the cemetery to investigate. I began noticing the old, weathered gravestones, a strange sensation settling over me as I surveyed the area. After some searching, I stumbled upon a gravestone bearing the name Lydia Ward. What shocked me even more was the image on the grave. It was the girl who had asked for a ride. I was frozen in disbelief. Her date of death was engraved as 7 years ago. A chill ran down my spine as I read the words "killed" in a ritual. My mind began to spiral as the name and face felt eerily familiar. I couldn't shake the memory of another girl named Lydia. She had been killed in a satanic ritual. I realized that I might have been the one who witnessed her death all those years ago. When I was a student, I had taken part in a challenge to prove that demons weren't real and thought I was the only one at the cemetery. But suddenly, I was startled by the sound of a girl screaming. I followed the sound and discovered 3 men torturing a girl. I hid behind a bush to avoid being seen and watched as the men carried out what appeared to be some kind of satanic ritual. When the ritual ended, I thought it was over, or perhaps just a bizarre performance. Then, I saw the men sacrifice the girl, one of them holding a knife, attempting to take her life. I couldn't think of anything. I was terrified and quietly ran away. I acted like a coward, staying silent to avoid getting myself into trouble. My thoughts are now clouded by guilt and confusion. I was one of the last people to see Lydia alive. I feel responsible for not doing more, for not intervening when I saw her that day. I spent the next few days researching Lydia's death. I dug through old police records, spoke to former classmates, and visited the university archives. I discovered that Lydia's death was a tragic and mysterious event. Some students at the school had joined a cult-like group that conducted rituals in the cemetery, and Lydia was their victim. Although the police investigated, no one was convicted. My guilt grew as I realized that I had been there that day but was too afraid to intervene. Perhaps that's why her spirit has come to me. As I dug deeper into everything, I began experiencing strange occurrences. I constantly heard whispers in my home, and at night, Lydia appeared every night, standing at the foot of my bed with her sunken, sorrowful eyes, her mouth whispering softly. My room always felt cold, the air thick and heavy, as if her grief was pressing down on me. I began to wonder if Lydia's spirit was trying to tell me something. Perhaps her murder was tied to a larger conspiracy, and only I could uncover the truth. I returned to the cemetery. I felt her presence guiding me, leading me to a hidden spot behind an old mausoleum. I discovered numerous symbols etched onto the old stone walls and trees surrounding the cemetery. They resembled symbols used in ancient satanic rituals. My hands trembled as I took photos. The cult had used this place. Lydia had died here, sacrificed to summon whatever they worshipped. Piecing together everything I knew, I realized that Lydia's death was only part of a larger ritual that was taking place. The cult had used the lives of innocent people to summon dark forces, and Lydia was the final sacrifice. Overwhelmed by the truth, I knew I couldn't let this mystery remain hidden and unanswered any longer. I finally gathered enough evidence, photos, documents, symbols, to bring to the police and share what I had hidden and discovered. I knew that my actions were the only way to free her soul. The police finally launched a comprehensive investigation into the cult's activities, arresting several former students and members who had participated in the rituals. In the end, justice was served for Lydia, and her soul could finally rest after 7 years of torment. In the final moments, I visited Lydia's grave once more. This time, as I stood before her grave, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. By uncovering the truth, I had redeemed myself, and now I could let go of the guilt that had haunted me for so long. As Rick turned to leave, he glanced back and saw a figure standing in the distance, Lydia's red coat billowing in the wind. He smiled softly, knowing she was no longer trapped, but finally free. The possession of the red dress. Ben, my best friend, and I went to a remote lakeside campground for a quiet weekend of fishing. The night air was cold, peaceful, with only the crackling of the fire and the occasional splash of a fish jumping out of the water. We were enjoying this calm together. I suggested grilling the fish, and Ben agreed to gather firewood. He went to the forest's edge to find some. Along the way, he found a lot of dry branches scattered around, but then he saw something red in the darkness. As he got closer, he discovered a red dress. After a while, Ben returned with a bundle of firewood wrapped in the red dress. He intended to use it to start the fire, but I didn't pay much attention or think twice about using it as kindling. Not long after, we chatted while waiting for the fish to cook, but after a few seconds, Ben's face suddenly changed. When he stopped speaking, he made a strange noise from his throat. His attitude shifted, becoming oddly restless. Ben's eyes grew wild, and he suddenly became aggressively irrational. He grabbed the fish from the fire and started devouring it, even though it was still raw, as if he found it irresistibly delicious. I didn't understand why he was acting like that, but I was concerned the fish wasn't cooked. I decided to stop Ben from eating it all, fearing it might make him sick. Ben suddenly went berserk, yelling at me to give him the fish. That's when I realized something terrible had happened. Ben seemed to have lost his mind and control. Panicking, I had to restrain my friend. Eventually, I managed to calm Ben down, and he fell asleep. I was about to leave, planning to take him to the hospital to make sure he was okay. Since the situation seemed to have passed, I decided to take Ben home. It looked like it might rain, so we quickly left. It started pouring heavily. As I drove back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something dark had been awakened by the red dress. Ben went home to his wife, but things got worse. That night, Ben started sleepwalking, something he had never done before. In the late hours, his wife was awakened by a strange noise. She saw him rummaging through the closet. He kept saying, "Wait for me," throwing clothes around, not responding to his wife, until he found his wife's red dress in the closet. Ben pulled it out and stared at it for a moment, then decided to put it on and went to bed, as if nothing had happened. His wife assumed he was just sleepwalking, so she said nothing. Ben's wife noticed that things were becoming increasingly strange since Ben went fishing with me, so she came to me for help. I returned to the lake, hoping to uncover or find something. I built a large fire to keep wild animals away from the old campsite. I returned to the old campsite. I was shocked to see that the dress was torn and scorched, yet still strangely intact, as if it had been deliberately left there. I realized the rain must have put out the fire that day. I walked through the forest to the places near where we had fished. Then my gaze was drawn to a rope tied to a tree branch, as if marking something. I approached and stumbled upon a corner of a notebook lying on the ground near the base of a tree, as though someone had buried it there. The journal revealed the tragic story of a woman named Elena, who had lived in the forest many years ago. She was known for wearing the same red dress, a gift from her lover. However, her love turned to jealousy and obsession, and after a tragic incident, she was murdered by him. Elena's spirit, bound to the red dress, sought to take the souls of others to keep her company in the afterlife. The dress served as a conduit for the spirit, and those who interacted with it would become vessels for her rage and obsession. I returned to the same spot. Ben was now kneeling at the base of the tree, staring at the scorched red dress. Then he reached for it. Ben suddenly lunged at me, becoming more aggressive like a beast. I struggled to overpower him to get the dress. I tried to wrestle Ben off to get the dress. Desperate, I grabbed the red dress and threw it into the fire I had built earlier. This time, I had to make sure it burned completely. As the dress burned, Ben collapsed to the ground, his face twisted in agony, as if he had just woken up from a terrible nightmare. Ben's eyes were filled with confusion and horror as he stared at the dress still burning. In the days that followed, Ben tried to return to normal life, but he remained haunted by the red dress and the woman in the forest. Every time he saw the color red, he became terrified. After everything that happened, I too was affected by what I had witnessed, but I tried to forget it. Believing the worst was finally behind us. Message on the mirror. Lily was living in an old apartment, a temporary home. The unique feature of the apartment was the mirrors. They reflected every corner of the space. Some were framed with antique designs, while others appeared worn and aged. Although Lily found them beautiful, They sometimes exuded a strange, unsettling feeling. Lily sat on the couch, reading a book. The apartment was enveloped in silence. Suddenly, Lily stopped. She heard footsteps. She sat still, listening. The sound continued, but when she looked around the room, no one was there. She shivered, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. Lily got up and glanced at the mirrors along the hallway. In the dim light, each mirror reflected her image, but with a strange distortion. A slight chill ran down her spine, but she ignored it. Lily stood in front of the bathroom mirror. The overhead light flickered as she washed her face, but she stopped when she saw something strange in the reflection. There was a shadow, resembling a man, pressed against the window. His face was obscured, but the outline of his body was unmistakable. Lily quickly turned around, but the bathroom was empty. A wave of fear washed over her. The unsettling feeling grew stronger. At night, she felt she wasn't alone, as if someone was standing just outside her line of sight, watching her. One night, just before bed, she went to the living room to watch TV. Then the feeling returned. She was tense, filled with fear, unsure if she was imagining it. But she saw it, a hand sliding past the curtain. Lily cautiously stood up and turned to look. The curtain swayed, but there was nothing behind it. Her breathing quickened, and a cold, heavy sensation filled the room. Then suddenly, from behind her, a shadow emerged from the darkness. It was unmistakably the figure of a man. He wore filthy, tattered clothes, his face gaunt and pale. He said nothing, only stared at Lily as if waiting for her to act. Her legs trembled, but she forced herself to move toward the door. Lily ran down the hallway. She reached the front door, fumbling with the lock. She glanced back to see the man's eyes, filled with amusement, a satisfied smile on his face as he watched her every move. She struggled to open the door, bursting out into the night, gasping for air. Her legs gave out as she stumbled down the stairs. She stood at the building's entrance, breathing heavily, asking for help from those around. They helped her call the police. The police arrived within minutes and stormed into the apartment. She told them about the man, about what she had seen inside, but they seemed skeptical. Everything in the apartment was untouched, and nothing was missing. There were no signs of forced entry. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The red and blue lights of the police cars flashed across the old building, leaving her alone once again. Lily stood outside, unable to bring herself to go back inside. She looked up at her apartment window, and for a moment, she thought she saw a faint figure standing there. Watching her from behind the glass, she shivered, knowing she couldn't stay there any longer. It was time to pack up and leave for good. A few days later, she returned to the house. Lily stepped out of the car, taking a deep breath. She was here one last time to gather her belongings, before leaving this strange place forever. The hallway seemed darker than before. The dim lights flickered weakly as she walked down the narrow corridor, her footsteps echoing faintly. Lily paused for a moment before the door, hesitating as her hand hovered over the doorknob. Then she slowly opened the door and stepped inside. The familiar chill hit her as she entered the apartment. She was ready to leave this place behind. As she walked through the living room, she caught a glimpse of herself in one of the mirrors. Her reflection looked almost unfamiliar, distorted by the unease she felt. Lily looked away, trying to focus on packing her belongings. Walking down the hallway, she came across an old mirror covered in dust, one she had never noticed before. It sat at the end of the hallway, almost forgotten beneath its dusty covering. She moved closer to the mirror. It was coated with a thick layer of dust, but something about it drew her attention. Slowly, she pulled the cloth away. She shuddered at what she saw. Written faintly in the dust on the mirror were the words, "Hello," and just below it, "I like you." Lily held her breath as she stared at the mirror. Had it always been there? She tried to reason with herself, convincing herself. It must have been there for a long time. She shook her head, trying to ignore the growing paranoia. Lily went into the bedroom, hastily gathering her belongings to pack and leave. As she passed the bathroom, a sudden chill ran down her spine. She stopped, slowly turning her head to look inside. Lily's heart skipped a beat. The bathroom sink faucet was running. She was certain she hadn't left it on. She cautiously stepped into the bathroom, her eyes fixed on the mirror. A message appeared on the fogged glass. "You are mine." Lily froze in terror. She had heard horror stories about people secretly living in others' homes. Was she unknowingly a victim? Trembling, she reached out to turn off the faucet. Slowly, she extended her hand and touched the surface of the mirror. She was shocked to feel a small latch, and the mirror suddenly moved, swinging open like a door. Lily staggered backward as the mirror revealed a hidden space behind it, larger and darker than she could have ever imagined. Then her heart nearly stopped. A face emerged from the darkness. It was a man, his hair disheveled, his wide eyes and a toothy grin, the shadows seemingly swallowing his body, making him appear as just a floating head. Below, the floor was cluttered with clothes, various trash, and some personal belongings. Panic surged through her. Lily turned, grabbed her keys, and bolted out of the bathroom. Lily burst through the front door of the building. She ran to her car, slammed the door shut, locked it, and called the police. The police arrived quickly. The man was eventually caught, still wearing that unnerving, unnatural smile. The police searched the apartment. They discovered a hidden space behind the bathroom mirror containing personal items, canned food, and things Lily recognized as her own. The man had been living there, watching her, moving around the apartment whenever she was out. When they apprehended him, he refused to explain or answer any questions from the police, sometimes sulking, other times aggressive, appearing mentally unstable. Lily felt incredibly lucky that the man was merely an agitated intruder and not a murderer. Otherwise, things could have been far worse. She started the car, glancing at the apartment one last time. Then she drove away, leaving the apartment and its horrors behind. Horrible night train ride. It was a cold autumn evening, and the train station was nearly deserted. The dim streetlights flickered in the distance as I hurried through the empty streets. I had walked for 30 minutes from my university and was about to catch the 9 p.m. train. I ran to the platform just in time as the train stopped in front of me. I stepped inside, glancing at the empty train cars. It was always quiet at this hour of the night, with only a few passengers. I found an empty seat by the window and sat down. I opened my notebook to review my lecture notes. The train gently rumbled as it pulled away from the station. The rhythmic clattering of the wheels on the tracks was soothing, almost enough to drown out the unease gnawing at me. I looked around the train car and was surprised to see another passenger. A girl was sitting a few rows away, her head bowed, her face hidden by long, dark hair. I hadn't noticed her when I first boarded. She didn't move, just sat there, completely still. Something about her posture made me uneasy. She was hunched over as if staring intently at something at her feet, but I couldn't see what. I tried to focus on my notes, but my mind kept drifting back to her. She had been sitting still for a long time. The longer I sat there, the more uneasy I felt. Suddenly, I heard a faint rustling sound. I looked up. She was no longer in her seat. Now she was right in front of me. I found it strange because I hadn't seen her move at all. A moment ago, she had been several rows away, and now here she was, her pale face directly in front of me. Her skin was almost ghostly white, and her eyes were wide, black, and empty, staring at me without blinking. Then she smiled, a smile that made me jump in fear. She began to speak, her voice soft, whispery, and strange. She greeted me and introduced herself as Jan. She then asked for my name. For a moment, my throat went dry, and I couldn't speak. I hesitated, stammering my name. Her smile grew wider, and she tilted her head slightly as if studying me.
Nice to meet you, T.
Her eyes never blinked, just stared straight into me. I felt a bit uncomfortable, but I tried to remain calm. I told myself she was just a strange student, maybe someone a little socially awkward. After an awkward silence, she finally spoke. She asked me if I had noticed anything strange and why this train was so empty. Then, with a curious tone, she asked if I had heard the rumors. My heart skipped a beat. She leaned closer, whispering,
People have gone missing on this train. Everyone at school knows about it. That's why I usually don't take this train. But tonight, I had no choice.
Her words sent chills down my spine. I hadn't heard any rumors, but the way she said it, the intensity in her eyes, it gave me goosebumps. I forced a smile, trying to break the tension. I had never heard that story before. I glanced around the empty train car. The train kept moving, the world outside darkening. Suddenly, Jan's expression changed. She froze, her eyes wide as she whispered, trembling, asking if I could hear something. I frowned, straining my ears to listen. I listened harder, but all I could hear was the sound of the train on the tracks and the engine. Her eyes were fixed on the window, her face creased with fear.
It's getting louder,
she said.
Listen carefully.
I just wanted to ignore her, to dismiss whatever she was saying. Then, I saw it. A shadowy figure, flickering in and out of view, running alongside the train, its limbs long and distorted. It moved unnaturally fast. I asked what it was, but she didn't answer, her face pale with fear. She whispered,
It's coming.
The train shook. The lights flickered for a moment. I jumped, gripping the edge of my seat. The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, Jan was gone. I blinked, my mind reeling. How could she have disappeared like that? I stood up, looking around the car, but there was no sign of her. The train began to slow down. The door slid open, and a thick darkness enveloped me. I couldn't see anything. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, my breath visible in the cold air. And then I felt it, a cold hand gripping my shoulder. Horrible night train ride. From behind, I felt an icy hand gripping tightly on my shoulder. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as the cold fingers tightened. Slowly, I turned my head, but there was no one there. I staggered back out of the compartment, my body shaking as I looked around frantically. The train was still there, silent and motionless on the tracks. I don't know where I am. The only light comes from the flickering light of the train window. I started walking along the length of the train, hoping to find some clue about where we had stopped. My footsteps crunched heavily on the gravel. Then, I heard a faint rustling noise behind me. Instinct told me to run, but I didn't know where to go. My only option was to go back inside. I couldn't stay out here, but the thought of stepping back into that strange train filled me with fear. Still, I had no other choice. Stepping inside, the air felt heavier, more stifling than before. The dim lights flickered weakly, casting shadows over the empty seats. In the distance, near the end of the train car, there was a figure sitting motionless, head bowed, just like the girl Jan I had met. I knew I shouldn't approach, but my legs moved on their own, carrying me toward her. I called out, my voice trembling, Jan? I stopped a few feet away, staring at the figure. Her hair hung limply over her face, wet and dripping, as if she had just emerged from a pool of water. I stepped closer, intending to touch her, calling Jan again. She didn't respond. Then, she finally moved. She slowly turned her head toward me. her movements unnaturally stiff, jerking like a robot. My breath caught in my throat as her face came into view. Her eyes, once dark and intense, were now completely empty, like black voids staring right through me. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her lips curled into that same strange smile as before. There was a faint hissing sound, perhaps coming from her. Before I could react, she stood up, her body rising off the ground, floating. Her feet no longer touched the floor. She hovered just above it, her long hair flowing in the air. I was frozen in place, horrified as Jan's form began to change, her body stretching and distorting. It was something I had never seen in real life. A voice echoed through the train car, coming from everywhere, surrounding me.
Why did you come back? Why are you here?
My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't be real. I needed to get out and leave. But when I turned to run, I felt something cold and invisible pressing against my chest. I moved like a puppet, being forced back into the seat. The lights flickered violently, casting wild, shaking shadows as if the train had come alive. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. Silence filled the air. I looked up, and there was Jan, floating, her long, translucent fingers reaching toward my face. She told me to come with her, that I could never leave. The cold radiated from her, seeping into my bones, freezing me. Her fingers brushed against my skin, and in that moment, I was no longer on the train. I was floating in an empty void, with nothing but the sound of my own panicked breathing. I tried to move, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't respond. I was trapped. Then, from the darkness, I saw them other figures, floating, drifting. Their forms were distorted, their faces obscured, and their eyes were empty. I couldn't breathe. Was this what happened to the missing passengers? Had they been brought here, into this void, to become part of this nightmare? And was I next? Suddenly, with a violent jerk, I was thrown back into reality. I was in my seat again, gasping for breath, drenched in cold sweat. Jan was gone. The train began to slow down, the familiar sound of the tracks returning. Finally, the train stopped at the station. The doors slid open, revealing an empty platform bathed in dim, flickering light. I staggered off the train, my legs weak and unsteady after what had happened. The doors closed, and as I turned back to look, the train began to move again, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't know if it was truly over. I stood there for a long time, staring into the void where the train had vanished. The Uber driver's nightmare trip. The Uber nightmare, it was just another night on the job. Not that I enjoyed these late shifts, but my rent was due in a week, and I'd already spent all my money on new tires and an oil change. I'd been driving every night. I really hated driving at night. The fog, the isolation, it always gave me chills. I had just dropped off a drunk couple from a bar when my phone buzzed, signaling the next ride. As I drove to pick up my next passenger, I noticed it was the exact spot where I had picked up the couple just half an hour earlier. I figured it was just a strange coincidence. I stopped at the pickup location but didn't see anyone. The fog had thickened, as if swallowing the entire street. I honked the horn and glanced around to see if anyone was coming, but there was no one. I quickly checked my phone to confirm the pickup spot on the app. Just as I was about to double-check the app, my back door suddenly opened, and my heart nearly jumped out of my chest. I let out a nervous laugh, even feeling a little embarrassed. It was a man. He didn't say a word as he got in and sat down, clutching a brown paper bag tightly. There was something unsettling about the way he held that bag. After a moment, he told me he knew the couple I had just dropped off. Then, he asked me to take him to the same location where I'd dropped them off earlier. I keyed in the address and started driving. A few miles down the road, my phone buzzed, and I nearly jumped. I got a notification from Uber that someone else wanted to be picked up along the way. It was odd, considering it was past 3 in the morning. I arrived at the new pickup location, and she was standing beneath a streetlight, making her easy to spot. She ran toward the passenger seat, and instinctively, I unlocked the door for her to sit up front. With the man in the back seat, I didn't want to take any chances. I turned away and focused on driving. I glanced at her again. There was something about the way she looked at the man in the back seat, as if they shared a connection, but weren't saying it out loud. We drove in silence. I checked the map. All 3 of them were headed to the same address where I'd dropped off the couple earlier. My mind started racing. What's going on? Why is she going there too? Then I curiously asked, "So, do you all know each other?" She smiled, turned to me, and nodded. "Yes," she said with absolute confidence. When we arrived at the address, I noticed all the lights were off. They began walking toward the house, and before leaving, the woman turned back and said, "Just wait here for a minute. We'll be right back." Both disappeared into the darkness. I stared ahead and sat there for a few minutes, wondering for a moment, should I just leave? Suddenly, there was a loud bang on my car window. She yelled, "Please, hurry, hurry. My friend needs help. We need your help to get her to the hospital." I tried to shake off the fear in my mind and got out of the car to follow her. When we reached the door, the man slammed it shut behind me. He shoved me to the ground, and I saw the knife in his hand. The woman's voice changed, her calm demeanor replaced by a cruel laugh. She slowly turned to me and told me to run while laughing maniacally. I crawled as quickly as I could to the dining room, and I couldn't believe my eyes, the couple I had dropped off an hour ago. But they were no longer alive. The man was now behind me. He was so close. I ran as fast as I could. Luckily, he slipped, giving me just enough time to sprint up the stairs. I wedged myself into a closet, trying to suppress my sobs. I wasn't sure how long I could stay hidden. Then I suddenly realized there was a figure, a woman, standing in front of the closet. Perhaps the blood trail on the floor had given me away. I hesitated, but saw she was alone outside. I took a chance, shoved the door open, and knocked her to the ground. I hurried to the window without hesitation. I smashed the glass, breaking it, and climbed out. Pain shot through my arm, but I ignored it. I couldn't go back. I just ran, got into my car, and drove straight to the police station. My efforts paid off. The next morning, investigators uncovered the full extent of the killer's crimes. Dozens of drivers had been lured to their deaths in the same way I had been. They had used ride-sharing services as a cover, abducting innocent victims one by one, all for their dark purposes. This ruthless duo had evaded capture many times, but not this time. They were arrested. I felt incredibly lucky because, as far as I knew, most people didn't survive. The nightmare, it seemed, had finally ended. Uber drivers, weird night. I had been driving Uber for about a year and had never really encountered any trouble, except for once when a drunk man tried to punch out my backseat window. But the only reason I quit this job has to do with something I had never encountered, and to this day, I still remember it vividly. Around midnight, I received a request to pick up someone named Pamela at an address that seemed a bit off the usual route. I drove to the address. The area was deserted, and there were no signs of anyone being around. Suddenly, the back door opened, and I jumped in surprise. Turning around, I saw an elderly woman, probably in her 80s. At this late hour, it was a bit odd, but I had seen older passengers before, though not very often. She silently struggled to get into the back seat, and I noticed her hollow, empty eyes, as if she had just woken up from a coma and couldn't make sense of what was happening around her. "How's your night, Pamela?" I asked cheerfully and friendly, but she didn't respond. A beep from my phone. A destination popped up. It was quite nearby, but I had never heard of it before, so I felt a little uneasy. I drove, trying to push that strange feeling out of my mind. The city blurred by in a haze, but then a voice, low and raspy, finally spoke. "Why aren't you taking me to that address?" she said to me. I told her I was taking her there, and it was still quite a distance. I replied, trying to stay polite. But the uneasy feeling, something wasn't right, kept growing. Then she started yelling at me, demanding I stop the car. It felt a bit rude, but what I needed to do now was stay polite. I wanted her out of my car, so I happily complied and stopped. I complied, stopping the car at a quiet corner just a few blocks away. I tilted my head to glance over my shoulder to wish her good luck, as it was part of my daily routine. But when I turned back, Pamela was right in front of my face, just millimeters away, hovering between the two front seats. I froze. Her eyes were white, sunken deep into her face. Her mouth was wide open, gasping for air, as if struggling and laboring to breathe. I stammered, "Pamela, are you okay?" Then her hand touched my shoulder. It was cold as ice, seeping into my skin and bones. Her pupils rolled back into her head, leaving her eyes completely white. My mind couldn't comprehend anything, and I began to fear for my own life. Before I could say anything, she leaned close to my ear and whispered in a chilling voice, "Go to the stairs tonight." I looked at her, confused. Pamela didn't say anything else, then climbed out of the car. I watched her shuffle toward a dilapidated building and disappear inside. I whispered to myself, not knowing what the hell had just happened. That night, I turned off the app and drove back to my apartment. When I arrived at the building, I sat in my car for about 10 to 15 minutes, trying to make sense of the woman's words. Eventually, I calmed down and went inside the apartment. I had just moved into this place because the rent was cheap, and it was an old building. People always complained about the maintenance and facilities. It really needed repairs, but the landlord never cared. I lived on the 6th floor. I went to the elevator and pressed the button, watching the numbers slowly go down. There was no one else in the lobby, but I couldn't shake the chill running down my spine. The numbers on the screen flickered. Suddenly, I heard a hoarse whisper, cold and close to my ear, "Close it." I jumped, looking around, but there was no one there. "Pamela, is she following me?" Sweat beaded on my forehead, and I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I sprinted toward the stairs, almost crawling on all fours as I climbed. The darkness below seemed to be chasing me. When I reached my apartment, I slammed the door shut and sat on the floor. Suddenly, I heard a loud crash. It sounded like something had collapsed to the ground, and the fire alarm went off, with people screaming. I opened the door and saw other tenants looking down the hallway, talking in panic. The elevator, it malfunctioned and crashed. The landlord was handcuffed and led away, charged with endangering tenants by neglecting maintenance. Other residents were shouting at him, angry at his irresponsibility. I stood still in disbelief that I was alive. As the police took the landlord away, I overheard two tenants talking, saying they remembered him once saying he had fixed it, but Mrs. Miller still died, crushed. They couldn't even imagine how terrified she must have felt when the elevator fell. "Who are you talking about?" I asked. One person answered, "That's Pamela Miller, the woman who lived in your apartment before you. She died in that very elevator, but somehow The landlord got away with it. I still visit her grave sometimes. God bless her. My head spun as I tried to understand. I had just driven a woman named Pamela. I realized that the woman I had met wasn't just a strange passenger. I had encountered something beyond my understanding. Maybe she was trying to warn me so I wouldn't meet the same tragic fate as hers. Run away from the stalker. It was one of those summer nights when the air was still, and everything seemed too quiet. The large, sprawling suburban house had a neatly trimmed lawn. Inside, Chase and I had no idea of the terror about to unfold. I was 15, hanging out at my friend Chase's house. His parents were out, and we were home alone. The basement was a paradise for any kid. It had a TV, a pool table, and video games. It was the kind of place where you forgot about everything outside, and we were living the dream. We sprawled out on the big leather couch, watching horror movies on TV and munching on potato chips. Chase had started dozing off. I was wrestling with my own unease, the kind of anxiety. I usually felt sleeping over at a friend's house, but tonight it was different. Much worse. It was probably past midnight when I heard it. A creak as a door slowly opened. I glanced behind the couch and saw something that unnerved me. The laundry room door in the basement was wide open. I wanted to believe it was a trick of my mind, maybe the wind, but I knew better. I quickly shook Chase awake. "Chase, wake up." The laundry room door. It opened on its own. Chase, groggy and half asleep, muttered something about it happening all the time and told me to go back to sleep. He didn't seem panicked, but I couldn't shake the eerie feeling crawling down my spine. I insisted he come with me to close it. We both got up and cautiously shut the door. Chase flopped back onto the couch and fell asleep within minutes. I tried to relax, but sleep wouldn't come easily. A little later, I woke up again, but this time, it wasn't a noise that startled me. Standing behind the couch, looking down at us, was a man. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The man was pale, sickly looking, with sunken eyes and an incredibly unsettling expression. He stood there, motionless, just staring at us. I screamed. Chase jerked awake, his eyes wide with fear as he saw the man moving toward us. In a panic, we ran. The basement had 2 exits. One led upstairs to the front door, and the other was a sliding door to the patio. We split up. I ran toward the patio door while Chase bolted up the stairs. Gasping, I quickly called the police, blurting out the address and frantically explaining that someone had broken into the house. But Chase, I couldn't leave him behind. I circled around the house, sneaking back in through the same door I had used to escape. My heart pounded as I stepped inside. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I knew I had to find Chase. I moved as quietly as I could, climbing the stairs, each step creaking beneath me. Then I heard it, Chase's voice. His screams were desperate, terrified cries for help. At the top of the stairs, I saw the man wrapping his arms around Chase's neck, choking him. His face twisted into a horrific expression. Chase's eyes were wide, his face red, struggling to breathe. I grabbed the nearest thing I could, a heavy sports trophy. Without thinking, I charged at the man. I swung the trophy with all my strength, smashing it into the intruder's head. The man collapsed onto the floor, and Chase fell with him, gasping for air but alive. We didn't wait. We ran outside, not stopping until we reached Chase's treehouse. There we hid, waiting for the sound of sirens. Chase was still trembling, rubbing his neck where the man's hands had been just minutes ago. We stayed silent, too afraid to speak. I peered out the small window in the treehouse, scanning the yard for any movement. The house looked eerily still, as if nothing had happened. Chase whispered, "What do we do now?" I had no answer. I just knew I couldn't let him go back inside. Suddenly, a faint rustling came from the direction of the house. I held my breath, straining to listen. At first, it was soft, like footsteps on grass. Then, I saw him, the man. He was slowly crossing the yard, his movements deliberate, as he headed toward the treehouse. I grabbed Chase's arm, pulling him away from the window. He's coming. The two of us backed into a corner of the small treehouse, barely breathing. The man's footsteps grew louder, the creak of the ladder. He was climbing. I could feel his weight pressing on the structure as the treehouse swayed slightly with each step. Chase looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. I had to do something. I scanned the cramped space, frantically searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a rusty toolbox. Chase's dad had left here months ago. I grabbed a metal rod nearby, clutching it tightly in my trembling hands. The man's hand appeared at the edge of the treehouse entrance, his fingers curling around the wooden frame. I swung the metal rod down with all my strength. The man let out a cry of pain, lost his balance, and fell backward off the ladder. He hit the ground hard. I grabbed Chase, and we climbed down, running as fast as we could toward the house. My mind was racing. Where could we go? And I knew it wouldn't be long before he got back up. Gasping for air, I dragged Chase to the side of the house where thick bushes and overgrown trees obscured us from view. We crouched down, trying to catch our breath. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance. It was the police. I whispered to Chase to wave for help. We stood there, cautiously peeking out from the bushes. I signaled Chase to follow me. We darted toward the path as the police car stopped. Relief washed over me as two officers got out, immediately surveying the area. I yelled, "He's still there! He's..." Before I could finish, the man stepped out of the shadows, emerging from the side of the house. His movements were slower, more calculated. Blood dripped from the gash on his head. The officers drew their weapons, ordering him to stop. But he didn't listen. He kept moving toward us, his eyes fixed on Chase and me. The man ignored them, continuing to walk slowly, cautiously. Then, without warning, he lunged forward with terrifying speed. A gunshot from the officers rang out, tearing through the night. The man staggered, collapsing onto the ground, gasping his last breath. A wave of numbness washed over me. Finally, it seemed like it was really over. That night, as Chase and I sat in the police station, I learned that the man was a drifter who had been living in abandoned houses around the city. He was mentally unstable, with a history of violent behavior. But the most chilling detail? In his pocket, they found an old, crumpled photograph. It was Chase's house. The man had been watching us for a long time. Chase and I stood outside the police station, waiting for our parents to pick us up. The terror of the night still weighed heavily on us. It was a reminder that true horror doesn't always come from the dark. It can stand right behind you, watching. Betrayal in the dark. It was a quiet night in late October, and I was patrolling the empty streets of our small Texas town. The air carried a heavy, ominous stillness that often lingers in the early hours. Not much happens in our town after midnight. Occasionally, a bar fight or a stray animal wandering the streets. But that night, around 2:15 a.m., the radio crackled. I received a call. I picked up the radio, and there was a man on the other end. "Officer, please. I think there's someone in my house." I could hear his breathing, rapid and shallow. Then, just as he was about to say something, the line cut off. I tried calling him back, but the call went straight to voicemail. I contacted my colleague to trace the location. I stopped, squinting at the GPS. It was a location just a few streets away, near the edge of town. Something about his voice unsettled me, so I decided to check it out. I arrived at the address, but there was nothing there, just an empty lot. The wind whistled softly, brushing through tall, dry grass. I checked the GPS again. The location was correct, but there was no house, just emptiness. In the distance, A faint light flickered on the porch of a farmhouse. I felt an inexplicable pull. I decided to walk to the farmhouse, thinking perhaps they might know something. I parked and approached the door. I knocked, and after a few moments, the door creaked open. A young man answered. He looked tired, confused, and not at all like someone who had made a desperate phone call. "Can I help you, officer?" he asked, squinting at me through the dim light. I explained the call and asked if he had seen or heard anything unusual. He shook his head. I asked if he knew of anyone else living nearby. The man shook his head slowly. "No, sir. There aren't any houses for miles." I thanked him and returned to my car, the unease in my chest growing stronger. I checked the radio again and tried calling the number once more, but it still went straight to voicemail. I decided to head back to the station, but as I turned the key in the ignition, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. There was someone sitting in the back seat. I could only make out a shadow, a hunched figure barely visible in the darkness. My heart pounded as I tried to stay calm, reaching for the radio to call for backup. But before I could, I felt a sharp blow to the back of my head, pain exploding as everything went dark. I woke up dazed, my head throbbing. My hands were tied, and the room smelled of damp wood and rust. A single bulb swung overhead, casting long, jagged shadows. And then I saw him. It was my colleague, Jeff. His face twisted into a maniacal grin, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You didn't expect to see me, did you?" he sneered. "I've been waiting for this," he continued, pacing with a gleaming knife in his hand. "Do you know how long I've had to smile through your success, Brad? While I was stuck with scraps?" He lunged, pressing the knife close to my face. He started taunting me about how I was always calm and how he'd see how calm I'd remain now. The cuts weren't deep, but they stung. Blood trickled down my skin as he mocked me, savoring every moment. I waited, biding my time. His grip on the knife loosened as he got lost in his rage. When he leaned too close, I acted. I kicked his shin with all my strength, making him stumble. My hands were still tied, but I used my shoulder to charge at him, slamming him into the wall. The knife fell to the floor. He was stunned, giving me just enough time to grab the knife with my bound hands. I bolted out of there. Behind me, Jeff staggered out, shouting my name, but his voice faded as I ran toward my patrol car. I stumbled into the police station, bloody but alive. My colleagues rushed to me, their faces a mix of shock and concern. I told them everything. Jeff was arrested. He sat calmly, as if nothing had happened, but his eyes gleamed with malice. Weeks later, I drove past the place where it all began, but now I understood better. Sometimes, the monsters we fear don't hide in the shadows. They stand right next to us, wearing friendly faces. Run away from strangers. The grocery store sat in the middle of a vast, empty parking lot, bathed in dim streetlight. It was 2 a.m. The store was closed, and an eerie quiet surrounded the building. I was the night shift manager here. Usually things were calm, and nothing happened, just me stocking shelves during the quiet hours while the rest of the world slept. I had been working non-stop since my shift began at 10 p.m., trying to get everything done. My focus was broken by a soft knocking sound. It was coming from the front of the store. I left my cart behind and walked toward the sound. Through the large glass windows, I saw him, a man. I approached the glass door. I asked him what he wanted. He demanded I open the door. His face was expressionless, devoid of a smile, just cold eyes staring at me. I told him the store was closed and he couldn't stay here. As I turned to leave, a loud bang made me whip around. The man's fists pounded the glass, over and over, each hit louder and angrier than the last. This guy wasn't just some harmless drifter. I pulled out my phone, threatening to call the police. Only then did he step back, his eyes still locked on me. full of rage. He slowly walked into the darkness of the parking lot. The tension in me eased slightly. He was gone. I put my phone away and tried to refocus on my work. 15 minutes passed. The knocking, the pounding, the man, all faded from my mind as I got lost in stocking the shelves. But then I heard metal breaking, like something being torn apart. I abandoned my cart and ran toward the front, fear swelling in my chest. My heart sank as I saw the glass door slightly ajar. The latch, the only thing keeping the door secure, was gone. Fear engulfed me as I realized what this meant. I needed to get to the office and call the police immediately. I turned to run toward the office, but I froze in place. Standing not far from me, blocking my path, was that man. His expression hadn't changed. It was still the same cold, deadly, furious stare. I didn't think. I just ran. I dashed through the door, with the man right behind me. Suddenly, an old, battered van screeched into view, speeding toward the front of the store. It swerved recklessly, nearly hitting me as it came to a stop, my heart pounding in my chest. I moved forward, running past the van, but then everything turned upside down. A sudden, sharp pain erupted in the back of my head. My body stumbled forward as I collapsed onto the ground. I didn't even have time to process what had happened before everything began to blur. I felt hands grabbing me, roughly lifting me off the cold asphalt. My vision faded, darkness closing in, and the last thing I remembered was the roar of the truck's engine and the sensation of being dragged inside. I woke up to a pounding headache, my wrists tied tightly behind my back. The truck jolted and swayed as it sped down an unfamiliar road. My mind was foggy, disoriented. For a moment, I had no idea where I was. I began piecing it together. The man. The truck. I had been kidnapped. I knew I needed to act quickly. I glanced around. Inside was pitch dark, but then I saw it. A pile of old tools, a rusty toolbox, and a few scattered pieces of metal on the floor. I twisted my wrists, testing the ropes. They were tight, but I could feel a slight give, just enough to give me hope. I heard the guy muttering to himself up front. This wasn't over. I took a deep breath, calming the rising panic within me. I needed to think, and I needed to get out. I edged closer to the toolbox, my fingers searching for anything sharp. It was tricky, but I managed to find a small piece of metal. I awkwardly twisted my hands, scraping the metal against the ropes. Every bump in the road threatened to give me away, as the pain nearly made me cry out. Suddenly, I felt the ropes loosen. A few more scrapes, and they snapped. My wrists were free, but I couldn't move too quickly. I glanced at the front seat, where I could see the back of the driver's head. He hadn't realized I was awake. I noticed the door lock was undone. I needed a plan. The truck slowed as it turned sharply onto a dirt road. The moment I had been waiting for. Taking a deep breath, I pulled the back door open and leaped into the night. I hit the ground hard, pain radiating through my body as I rolled across dirt and gravel. For a moment, I thought I couldn't move, but adrenaline surged within me. I staggered to my feet, running into the thick darkness of the surrounding trees. Behind me, the old van came to a halt. I heard the man shouting, his footsteps pounding as he chased after me, but I didn't look back. I just kept running, my heart racing in my chest. Branches scratched at my skin as I pushed through the thick underbrush. My mind blurred between fear and survival. I could hear the man's voice. I couldn't let him catch me again. Ahead, I spotted a clearing and saw the faint glow of lights through the trees. A road. If I could reach it fast enough, I'd be safe. I burst out of the woods and onto the road, frantically waving my arms as a car approached. The headlights blinded me, but I didn't care. I needed help. I ran into the middle of the road, screaming for them to stop. The car screeched to a halt, and I collapsed onto the road. The driver jumped out, shouting something, but I was too exhausted to respond. All I could do was whisper hoarsely, "Help." The driver took out his phone and called the police. In that haze, I could still see his shadowy figure standing at the edge of the forest, as if he were looking at me with eyes full of anger. But he didn't come any closer. Perhaps he knew that everything was over. I was taken to the hospital after everything that had happened. I was told the man had been apprehended not far away. He had been arrested. The police assured me he would be locked up, that he wouldn't hurt anyone again. Even though I was safe, the thought lingered in my mind. What if I hadn't escaped? What if I hadn't been fast enough? The fear remained, clinging to the edges of my mind, but I knew I had survived. I had been lucky to make it through that night shift alive. The deadly farewell. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as I walked through the sterile hallway of the hospital. I had worked here for years, the smell of antiseptic and the beeping of monitors ingrained in my senses. But lately, something felt different, something that always sent a chill down my spine. My patients came in all ages, but there was one little girl named Tira, perhaps the youngest patient in the hospital. Tira was a sweet child. She often wandered the halls and talked to other patients, though she was mostly alone. One night, while working a night shift, I was doing my rounds as usual. In the empty, long corridor, I heard two people talking softly. It was late, and all patients were supposed to be asleep. I followed the sound, which was coming from room 203. As I carefully opened the door to check, I saw her. Tira was standing near the patient's bed, smiling at me mysteriously and greeting me. But my sudden appearance didn't startle her at all. I reminded her that it was past bedtime and asked what she was doing there. She replied,
"Nothing. I just came to say goodbye to George."
George was the patient in room 203. He had recently undergone major surgery. Though Tira seemed calm to me, I noticed George's face. He looked terrified and extremely pale. When I turned to remind her and take Tira back to her room, she had vanished as quickly as if she'd never been there. The next day, I went home around 4 a.m. after my night shift ended. It was my day off, so I slept the entire day. When I returned to work and walked past room 203, I thought about checking on George. But when I opened the door, I found a different patient, and I was informed that George had passed away the previous day. I stood frozen in the hallway, suddenly remembering when I asked Tira what she was doing in George's room. She said she came to say goodbye. But why goodbye? Shouldn't it have been good night? Something was very strange. Every time I encountered little Tira, I would find her wandering the empty hallways at night, talking to someone or entering a room. At first, I was skeptical, but I noticed that her presence seemed to coincide with the moments just before a patient passed away. Could she possess the strange ability to know when someone was about to die? Then I searched the hospital records. Tira wasn't listed anywhere. There was no information about her being admitted, and no legal guardianship papers on file. I was stunned. I gradually became obsessed with Tira's story and started investigating her background. My suspicions grew when I learned from a nurse that Tira had died in the hospital just a few months ago after falling down the stairs. However, the nurse insisted the incident was ruled an accident, and the hospital never made it public. My mind reeled. How could Tira still be here if she was dead? I started piecing things together, and a chilling thought struck me. Perhaps Tira's spirit was still lingering here. One day, when I dozed off at my desk, I saw her. She was sitting, crying in my dream. I slowly approached Tira. Tira turned to face me, her pale face and empty eyes brimming with a profound sadness. She said,
I've been waiting for you, Dr. Cooper. You're the only one who can help me.
I stood frozen, the air thick with fear, or perhaps confusion. I asked Tira, "Help you? Tell me how." Tira's ghost stepped closer, her small hand reaching toward me. She whispered painfully,
The experiment. The experiment killed me.
I jolted awake at my desk, drenched in sweat from what I had seen. It was too real, like a cry for help. I knew I needed to act. I dug through old records, my hands trembling. I found it, just a copy, a part of a plan I'd never seen before. It all seemed to point to a dark secret. The deeper I delved into Tira's past, the more I realized her death was no accident. In reality, it was the result of an illegal medical experiment involving an unapproved drug to test the limits of human pain endurance and survival. Tira was selected as a test subject due to the influence of her adoptive father, a man working at the hospital as part of an underground network of unethical experiments. The drug used on Tira was untested and had horrifying side effects. Tira's death was the culmination of a cover-up to protect the hospital's reputation. One night, while working the night shift at the hospital, I heard strange noises, like a child crying, coming from the abandoned wing of the hospital. The sounds led me down a hallway that hadn't been used in years. My heart pounded as I pushed open a door, revealing a forgotten room. Tira stood there, her figure faint in the dim light, her eyes filled with sadness and pain. She told me that she couldn't leave, and that she had been trapped in the hospital ever since her death. Her spirit was tethered to the hospital, bound to the hallways, unable to move on until the truth about her death was revealed. Tira had guided other souls to the afterlife, but she herself was trapped here. When I made my final efforts to reveal the truth, the hospital management and the girl's adoptive father tried to discredit me, even going to great lengths to silence me by threatening my career. The hallways were empty, the hospital eerily silent. I walked through them, knowing they were trying to stop me. But I didn't falter, and I was determined to report everything to the authorities, ensuring that those responsible would be held accountable. As the authorities investigated, I stood in a patient's room, moonlight streaming through the window. I saw the silhouette of a little girl standing behind me. It was Tira, appearing now in a more peaceful form. She smiled, her eyes filled with gratitude. She thanked me, her voice gentle, as her figure began to fade away. Tira's departure finally brought clarity. The hospital faced public outrage, and the administration was forced to shut down. Her adoptive father was arrested for his involvement in the illegal experiments, and justice was served. Although Tira's ghost was gone, the darkness of the hospital remained, reminding me that the line between life and death, between justice and illegality, is often much thinner than we imagine. The woman disappeared in white clothes. I grew up hearing stories from my cousin, who worked at the local police station. He was the kind of person who had seen it all. But there's one story he told me that always sent chills down my spine, and it's true. This story is about the mysterious woman in white. It all started with a midnight call from a gas station attendant. My cousin's colleague, Officer Nathan, was working the night shift. The attendant claimed he had been robbed, and the thief fled before he called. A woman in a white dress with long black hair, incredibly beautiful. Strangely, the suspect wasn't a masked figure or some shady guy, but a woman. He explained that she had come to him, asking for help because she was lost in the middle of the night. He had gone to the office to notify his boss, but when they returned to the cash register, she was gone, and so was all the money. Nathan, the only officer on duty so late, immediately got in his patrol car and headed to the gas station. It was a deserted road, winding through the woods on the outskirts of town. As Nathan drove, his headlights caught movement up ahead. A dark shadow was slowly walking toward him. Walking alone in the opposite direction was a woman in a white dress. She matched the attendant's description exactly. He accidentally passed her by, but unsure if his eyes were deceiving him, he saw that she had no face as he drove by. Finding it too unbelievable, he slowed down and reversed to check if she was indeed the woman the gas station attendant had described. After reversing, he stopped and quickly stepped out of the car, saying, "You need to get in the car and come with me to the police station immediately." She said nothing and complied. On the drive back to the station, he asked her a few questions about why she had stolen the money. However, she didn't say a word. He looked through the rearview mirror as she sat in the back seat, staring intently at one spot until they arrived at the station. Her behavior was strange, so he thought the woman might have mental issues. After that, he decided not to ask her any more questions. When they got back to the station, they began interrogating her, but she still didn't speak. His shift was almost over, so he prepared to hand over the report to the incoming officers. Just before he was about to leave, she suddenly started talking. She gestured and spoke, promising to return the money the next day if they let her spend the night in the holding cell at the station. She kept insisting that she had nowhere to go, and the officers were quite confused by what she was saying, unsure of what to do. Nathan reported to his superiors. He was informed that they couldn't move her to another holding facility that day. So in the end, they agreed to her request and placed her in the holding cell. Before leaving, Nathan made a final call to the gas station, informing the attendant that they had caught the suspect. The money would be returned the next morning, or so they thought. The next morning, Nathan returned to the station. As he approached the woman's cell, he witnessed a horrifying scene. The cell was empty. The woman they had arrested the night before was gone, except for the crumpled body of a man, her cellmate. His face was shredded with deep scratches, his wide eyes frozen in terror, and his body was pinned to the wall with nails driven into the flesh. Scattered around him were bills, and a few banknotes that hadn't been found the day before were stuffed into his pockets. Worse still, scrawled in blood on the wall beside his body were the words, "I have paid the debt." Nathan frantically searched the area. Even more terrifying was that she had completely vanished. No one heard or saw anything. The cameras? They hadn't captured any footage of her entering or leaving the cell. She had disappeared without a trace. A thorough search was conducted. The surrounding area was combed, and every possible lead was followed. But the woman in white was never found. She simply vanished, like a ghost fading into the darkness. Even to this day, no one knows who or what she was, but the officers present that night remain haunted by the incident. That's the whole story my cousin told me. I sat and listened, and I could still see the fear in his eyes when he spoke about her. The question that always haunted me was how she managed to escape from the cell. Was she human, or something far worse? The strangest part is that she evaded all the surveillance cameras. After countless investigations, they still don't know what happened that night or where she went. The haunting of invisible ghosts. His name was Henry, and he always enjoyed taking late-night walks. There was something about the stillness that made everything feel simpler. It had been this way for years, a nightly routine for him and his dog, Boss. Henry had been a welder for over 40 years. Now, he was living alone on this large farm. The house, too big for just one person, had felt empty ever since Maria, his wife, passed away. Henry's children had moved out long ago, and after cancer took his wife's life, it was just Henry, left alone with the memories. Tonight, after a long day, Henry decided to take a walk. The cool night air was refreshing, and his dog Boss trotted beside him, his nose sniffing the ground as if searching for something. As Henry made the loop around the house, something caught his eye, a flicker of movement in the second-story window. The bedroom window, the one that belonged to Maria. Henry stopped. For a moment, he thought he saw a shadow, something or someone moving inside. Henry's heart raced, not believing his eyes. He hadn't set foot in that room for years, let alone let anyone else in. Henry stared up at the window, unsure if his mind was playing tricks on him, but something wasn't right. Without hesitation, he rushed inside, Boss close behind, and stormed up the stairs 2 at a time. When Henry reached the bedroom, the door creaked open slowly. The room was empty, exactly as he had left it. Henry's eyes scanned the space, nothing out of place, no signs of anyone being there. Henry felt foolish for overreacting, but that unease, that creeping sensation, stayed with him. Something had been there, Henry was sure of it. The next night, Boss's low growl woke Henry from a deep sleep. He sat up, listening, straining to hear over the pounding in his ears. That's when he heard the creaking of floorboards. Henry's first instinct was to grab his rifle, and he moved into the hallway, raising the gun. A dark figure stood at the end of the hall. A woman, her face obscured by shadows, her hand stretched toward him, fingers unnaturally long. Another night passed. Henry came downstairs early in the morning, only to find the kitchen lights on. He remembered turning them off. Henry grew tense and started calling the police. They searched the entire house, even bringing in the K-9 unit, but nothing turned up. Henry could see it in their eyes. They didn't believe him, but he knew something was wrong. That was the last straw. The next night, Henry went back upstairs. He didn't know what compelled him to return, but when he opened the door, the sight nearly stopped his heart. Maria's clothes, which Henry had packed away after she died, were scattered across the floor. It was as if someone had pulled them out. Panic rose in his throat. Henry staggered back, and that's when he saw her. A figure stood in the doorway, a woman, but it wasn't Maria. Henry couldn't make out her face, but she was shorter, thinner, someone he didn't recognize, and her presence filled him with dread. Before he could react, she ran, disappearing down the stairs and into the night. Henry chased her to the front yard, but she was gone by the time he made it outside. Bosley and Henry searched the property, but there was no trace of her. Henry didn't sleep that night. In fact, he hadn't slept in days. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind outside it all felt like her, lurking, waiting to return. Henry kept his rifle close, afraid he might actually have to use it. A few weeks later, it happened again. Henry was sitting in the living room, trying to distract himself with the television when he saw her. She was standing in the yard, staring at Henry through the window, just a shadow, silhouetted by the moonlight. Henry grabbed his rifle, his hands trembling, and ran outside, firing warning shots into the air. She turned and ran into the darkness, disappearing once again. The shots had probably scared her off for now, but deep down, he knew this wasn't over. The next day, after Henry had been out for errands and returned home late, he didn't see Boss greet him. He searched every corner of the house, but everything felt empty. But Henry still had one last room to check, Maria's room. He stumbled into the bedroom, the door creaking open. Maria's clothes were no longer scattered across the floor. They were neatly hung. But what Henry dreaded had come to pass. The woman was still there, sitting on the bed, staring at him. Her eyes gleamed, and she smiled a cold, twisted smile. She whispered that she had been waiting for him. Henry froze, shocked. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. That voice, it was Maria's. But something was wrong. It was cold, hollow. Before Henry could react, her face shifted from an indistinct blur to something grotesque, her skin melting into a monstrous form. The skin peeled away, revealing rotting flesh underneath. Her eyes sank into her skull, her mouth gaping in a horrifying grimace. Henry screamed and raised his rifle, but it was too late. She lunged at him, and as darkness engulfed him, her fingers seemed to scratch and penetrate his chest. The haunting of invisible ghosts. Henry slowly woke up with a strange feeling, something rough rubbing against his face. It took a moment for Henry to open his eyes and realize it was Boss licking his face. Henry remembered the last time he couldn't find his dog, but after everything that happened, seeing Boss made him feel more at ease. Henry groaned, his whole body aching as he struggled to sit up. Everything felt too stiff, the joints rigid, and the muscles dull with pain, as if she had actually lunged at him, clawing and piercing into his flesh. Boss whimpered softly, his gaze fixed on the bedroom door. Henry glanced over and saw nothing unusual, but he couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something strange was inside his own home. Days passed in a vague exhaustion. Every night, it was the same. Boss sat in front of the bedroom door, staring, ears pricked up as if waiting for something. Then, like clockwork, at that exact hour, he would start barking, the sound echoing throughout the house, jolting Henry from his restless sleep. He would get up, gun in hand, and search the house, but he never found anything. The house remained silent, the darkness unchanged. He tried to convince himself that it was just Boss being protective, or perhaps reacting to something normal outside. One night, the barking started again, more intense than ever. He jumped up, hurried down the stairs, gun at the ready, and froze at the sight before him. There, near the living room window, Mari was standing. Her face was gentle, hair flowing in the wind. Henry was paralyzed, an uncontrollable feeling swelling within him. Henry hadn't seen her in years. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of comfort. Boss fell silent, his barking turning into a faint whimper, as if something wasn't quite right ahead. He slowly approached the window, but then something changed. Henry stepped back as Mari's gentle form began to fade, her features distorting, as if cracking horribly, her joints twisting grotesquely, unnaturally. Her eyes seemed to darken, sinking into her face. Her mouth stretched into a wide grin, revealing sharp teeth, with black slime oozing through the cracks in her face. He suddenly realized she had come, perhaps deceiving him and appearing in the form of Mari's spirit. He knew that couldn't be his wife. The figure by the window vanished, dissolving into the darkness like smoke. Henry rushed outside, desperately searching for her, or it, whatever he had just seen. He circled the house, calling for Mari, as if somehow she might still be there, but there was no one. As Henry turned the corner of the barn, he suddenly felt an icy chill. The world around him seemed to shift. The night grew unnaturally dark. It felt like the darkness was swallowing the farm. He heard a whisper, soft and mocking.
Henry.
It was her voice, but distorted and broken, drawing him toward the barn. Henry pushed open the barn door, and there she was again, Mari standing motionless. The whispers grew louder around him.
Come home, Henry. It's time.
The voice echoed from every direction. The darkness closed in, pulling him to his knees as if hypnotized to obey. Her form began to twist again, skin peeling away, revealing a skeletal grin beneath. The barn door slammed shut behind Henry with a piercing noise, swallowing the faint light of the moon. The air filled with voices chanting Henry's name, full of malice. He stumbled back, desperate to escape, but the ground beneath him gave way, sending him plunging into a deep, cold pit. He landed hard on a damp surface. Henry reeled from the overwhelming stench of decay, and as he looked around, rotting corpses, with sunken eyes, stared back at him. He tried to climb out, but the walls of the pit were slick. The bodies began to move, their skeletal hands reaching out, grabbing Henry's legs, pulling him down. A grotesque figure emerged from the darkness above. It was her again, a monstrous version of Mari. Limbs elongated, her smile impossibly wide, filled with jagged, blackened teeth.
Henry, it's time to join us,
she said. Then suddenly, Henry found himself in Mari's old room. The figure leaned closer, its icy breath brushing against his skin.
You can't escape, Henry.
He felt an unnatural pressure tightening around his neck, and he couldn't move. As his vision darkened, it was slowly taking control of him. The first light of dawn crept over the farm. The house lay still and cold, its windows dark and empty. Boss lingered on the porch, his mournful howl echoing across the silent fields. No one knew what really happened. Henry was gone, or perhaps he was still there, but no longer himself. Strange clown in the parking lot. It was a chilly October evening in 2016, just a few weeks before Halloween. My friends, Jake and Sarah, and I decided to catch a late-night movie at the local theater. After the movie, which ended around midnight, we lingered in the parking lot, chatting and enjoying the crisp autumn air. The parking lot was mostly empty, illuminated by a few dim streetlights, creating long shadows that danced eerily around us. As we laughed about the horror movie we had just seen, Jake suddenly fell silent, staring behind us. We turned to see a clown standing by an old, beat-up car at the edge of the parking lot. He was dressed in a dirty, oversized clown suit with a red wig and smeared white face paint. Unlike the clowns at birthday parties, this one had a sinister air about him, his smile too wide and his eyes too dark. At first, we thought it was a prank. After all, clown sightings had become a bizarre trend that year. But as he started walking towards us, the playful notion quickly vanished. His movements were slow and deliberate, and in his gloved hand, he held a balloon that bobbed menacingly with each step. Nervously, we decided to head to Jake's car, which was parked a short distance away. We tried to act casual, but our pace quickened with each step. The clown followed, maintaining a steady, unnerving pace. My heart pounded as we reached the car and scrambled inside. Jake fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. Just as we locked the doors, the clown reached the car. He leaned against the driver's side window, his face inches away from Jake's. He pressed the balloon against the glass and slowly dragged his finger down the window, leaving a streak in the condensation. We could see his eyes clearly now, cold and calculating. He tapped on the glass, the sound echoing in the silent parking lot. We were frozen with fear, unsure of what to do next. The clown then moved to the front of the car, standing directly in the headlights. He reached into his oversized pocket and pulled out a long, jagged knife. The sight of the blade sent a fresh wave of panic through us. Jake finally snapped out of his shock and started the car. The engine roared to life, and the clown took a step back, still smiling that unsettling smile. We peeled out of the parking lot, tires screeching, and didn't stop until we were miles away, parked in front of a 24-hour diner. We sat in the car, catching our breath and trying to make sense of what had just happened. We debated calling the police, but without any real harm done, we doubted they'd take us seriously. In the end, we decided to keep the story to ourselves, not wanting to relive the terrifying encounter. To this day, the image of that clown and his menacing smile haunts us. We often wonder what his intentions were and shudder at the thought of what might have happened if we hadn't reached the car in time. The experience left a lasting impression, A chilling reminder that sometimes the scariest encounters are the ones that seem to step straight out of a nightmare. Stalker at the bus stop. A quiet and snowy Sunday evening. I was sitting at the bus stop, looking at my phone, and realized I had missed my bus. I started to shiver as the weather grew colder. Time passed slowly. I pulled out my phone again, put on my earphones, and selected a song to forget the uncomfortable cold. I looked around, realizing I was completely alone. No cars, no pedestrians, just an endless, empty street. Nearly an hour went by, and the bus was still nowhere in sight. I checked my phone again. The screen showed no updates on the bus's arrival, and the battery was dangerously low. A while later, I sensed some movement. A man wrapped in several layers of thick clothing, his face obscured by a knitted hood. The man walked with a strange, almost unsteady gait, as if he wasn't sure where he was going. I froze but tried to focus on my phone, not wanting to draw attention. The man approached the bus stop and sat at the opposite end of the bench. My discomfort grew. I glanced at the man, noticing part of his face exposed under the hood, a gaunt, pale face with eyes that seemed unfocused, distant. The man was muttering something to himself, his words slurred and incoherent. I shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something was off about this person. He moved closer, almost imperceptibly at first, but with each subtle shift, he inched toward me. My unease turned into panic as the man continued to slide closer, his gaze fixed on me in a strange, unsettling way. I felt a chill run down my spine. Suddenly, I felt the man's presence right next to me. The tension was unbearable. I quickly stood up, grabbed my bag, and started walking away from the bus stop. The man, still sitting there, tilted his head to the side, his eyes never leaving me as I walked away. I quickly walked away. I reached the next bus stop and finally felt somewhat relieved. I began to sit down slowly, letting my guard down a little as I waited for the bus. I closed my eyes for a moment, exhausted. The quiet of the falling snow was almost peaceful. Suddenly, a loud and rapid knock shattered the silence. My eyes shot open, my heart racing, and I slowly turned around to see the man from the previous bus stop, standing on the other side of the glass, his face pressed against it, grinning maniacally. His eyes were wide, staring straight at me without blinking. He kept knocking on the glass, his breath fogging up the surface. Panic flooded my body. I quickly stood up and backed away from the glass. The man began moving, circling around, his gait more erratic than before. His footsteps grew closer. I backed away, yelling at the man to stay away. However, the man was undeterred. He raised his hand, reaching out as if to do something to me. Luckily, I reacted just in time, darting off the sidewalk as the man lunged toward me. In a strange, inexplicable way, he slipped forward, his face slamming hard into the cold, icy pavement. The sound was horrifying. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It was so bizarre. I watched in horror as blood began to pool around the man's face, staining the snow with a deep red. My mind raced as I tried to process what had just occurred. I crouched down, attempting to get a response from him, but there was none. I sat down on the curb, my hands trembling as I pulled out my phone and called for help. The snow continued to fall, turning this bus stop into a place of horror and dread for me. The flashing lights of the ambulance and police car pierced through the night. Paramedics rushed to the man's side, but it was clear that something was very wrong with him. As the paramedics searched the man's belongings, they found a photograph in his wallet, a picture of the man with a boy who looked eerily similar to me. The police explained that the man had been on prescription drugs after losing his son, and his mental state had deteriorated ever since. I realized, with disbelief, that the man may have mistaken me for his lost son. A few days later, I took my driving test. As I drove, I glanced down the road where the bus stop was in the distance, the events of that night still haunting me deeply. I couldn't shake the sorrow of the man's grief and the terrifying experience that had unfolded. The elevator of apartment 13. I had just moved into a new apartment building, a towering structure of steel and glass in the heart of the city. The building was modern, with sleek finishes, key-card access, and an array of amenities. But what attracted me most was the affordable rent, something almost too good to be true in this part of town. My apartment was on the 13th floor, which didn't bother me despite the superstitions surrounding that number. The first few weeks were uneventful. I was still settling in, getting used to the sounds of the city and the hum of the building. The neighbors were quiet, and I rarely saw anyone in the hallways or elevator. However, I began to notice something strange about the elevator itself. Every time I used it, it seemed to take longer to reach my floor, and there was always a strange clicking noise just before the doors opened. One evening, after a long day at work, I stepped into the elevator, ready to unwind in my apartment. The elevator was empty, as usual, and I pressed the button for the 13th floor. The doors slid shut with a soft hiss, and the elevator began its ascent. As I leaned back against the wall, I felt the familiar sensation of the elevator moving, but then, abruptly, it stopped. The lights flickered, and for a moment, I was plunged into darkness. My heart raced as I fumbled for my phone, using its screen as a makeshift flashlight. The elevator jolted, and the lights came back on, dimmer than before.
Help me!
The floor indicator showed that I was between the 12th and 13th floors. I pressed the buttons repeatedly, but nothing happened. Suddenly, the elevator began to descend slowly, as if under someone else's control. The air grew thick, and I felt a strange pressure on my chest, like something heavy was pressing down on me. The clicking noise started again, louder this time, echoing through the small space. I glanced at the ceiling, half expecting to see the source of the noise, but there was nothing there. The elevator stopped on the 10th floor, and the doors opened. I peered out into the hallway, which was eerily dark, the overhead lights flickering sporadically. My instincts told me to get out, but something held me back. There was a presence in the hallway, something unseen but undeniably there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I quickly pressed the closed door button, my hands trembling. The doors shut, and the elevator continued its descent, but the clicking noise didn't stop. It was almost rhythmic now, like footsteps above me. I stared at the ceiling, fear gripping me as the noise grew louder and faster. The elevator stopped again, this time on the 8th floor. The doors creaked open, and I saw a shadowy figure standing in the hallway, just out of the light's reach. My breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching. The temperature in the elevator plummeted, and my breath came out in visible puffs. I slammed my hand on the buttons, desperate to get the elevator moving again, but it refused to respond. The shadow began to move toward me, slowly, deliberately. Just as it reached the threshold of the elevator, the doors snapped shut, and the elevator plunged downward, faster than before. I held onto the railing, my heart pounding in my ears. The clicking noise was now deafening, as if whatever was in the elevator shaft was right above me, following me. The elevator stopped suddenly, the doors opening to the lobby. I stumbled out, gasping for air, and looked back just in time to see the shadowy figure standing in the elevator, its hand outstretched as if reaching for me. The doors closed, and the elevator ascended again, disappearing into the darkness of the shaft. Shaken, I reported the incident to the building management, but they found nothing wrong with the elevator. I moved out the next day, unable to shake the feeling that something malevolent was lurking in that elevator, something that wasn't bound by the rules of the living. To this day, I avoid elevators, especially in old buildings, and I'll never forget the feeling of that cold, oppressive presence in the apartment building of 13. It was a reminder that some places are haunted not by ghosts, but by something far more sinister. Train to Hell. Rai, he had once been a professional thief. No matter where he was, he could carry out his actions smoothly. That day, the location was the subway, and it was also where he would pay a heavy price for his sins. While fleeing from pursuit, Rai boarded a subway train that looked quite old, carrying the scent of damp concrete, rust, and something faintly metallic, almost like the smell of blood. The subway car was nearly empty, except for a few scattered passengers in various cars. Most of them seemed lost in their own worlds. One was dozing off, another absorbed in their phone. But then, at the far end of the car, there was an older man who looked quite terrifying. He wore a long, dark coat, his face obscured by shadows, but his eyes were cold and piercing, chillingly sharp. Rai tried to shake off the discomfort, shifting in his seat, looking elsewhere. But the feeling of always being watched made him very alert. The subway suddenly jolted, the lights flickering more violently before dimming to a weak, pale yellow. The train began to slow down, the sound of the brakes screeching like a high-pitched wail echoing through the thief's skull. He glanced around, noticing that the other passengers had disappeared, leaving only him and the mysterious man at the end of the car. He tried to stand up, move toward the exit, but his legs were stiff. The man in the dark coat began to stand up, moving toward him with slow, deliberate steps, his eyes never leaving the thief. The subway train came to a complete stop. The doors remained closed. The thief was trapped. The man approached the thief, raising one hand with fingers unusually long and thin, and waved it slowly in front of the thief's face. The thief's eyes glazed over, his mind succumbing to the invisible power of hypnosis. His body went limp, collapsing into the seat as he was pulled into a vision, deeper and deeper, until the subway car completely vanished. Rai found himself standing in a nightmarish version of a subway station. The walls were cracked and oozing a thick black substance, the lights flickering. The tracks were covered in a dense, glowing red fog that seemed to rise from the very depths of the earth, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. The thief staggered forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he looked around, trying to find a way out. But the exits were blocked, sealed shut by heavy iron gates covered in chains and padlocks that had mysteriously appeared. A moment later, he suddenly saw a reflection in the glass, a reflection of himself, but with his coat tattered and scorched, his face pale and gaunt, with hollow, sunken eyes, his lips twisted into a grotesque, terrifying smile. Scenes of his past crimes played out before him, distorted and twisted into horrific images of suffering and despair. In one scene, he watched himself pickpocketing a man on the subway, but this time, the man turned to him, his face melting away to reveal a skull with eyes burning with fire. The skeletal figure grabbed the thief's wrist, pulling him into the darkness where the sound of screams echoed. Next, another vision unfolded. Rai broke into an apartment, and suddenly, the floor beneath him collapsed. He fell into a pit filled with writhing hands, clawing at his flesh as they dragged him down, as if pulling him into hell. The images kept coming, each more horrifying than the last. Each vision was a punishment for the sins he had committed. He saw himself as one of the damned, trapped forever on this hellish train, riding the tracks of torment for all eternity. Inside the train, the thief was surrounded by the ghosts of his past victims. Their eyes burned with the fire of hatred. In his own eyes, the furnace roared with life, the flames growing hotter until they consumed everything. The thief was left in total darkness. The thief snapped back to reality, gasping for breath, his body drenched in sweat. He was back in the subway car. The man in the dark coat was gone, leaving only the sound of the train clattering on the tracks. Shaking, the thief staggered to his feet and exited the train. As he stepped onto the platform, he glanced back at the subway car. The train pulled away, the sound of its departure echoing through the empty station. The thief stood alone, the weight of his sins pressing down on him. Now he knew that there was no escaping the consequences, the punishment for his actions. Since that day, he has lived in darkness, plagued by agonizing headaches that feel like torture. He must live in fear, haunted by what he had seen and experienced. Perhaps this is just one of the punishments he has to endure. The old classroom was sealed off. It was my senior year of high school when the rumors about room 217 started circulating. Room 217 was an old, unused classroom tucked away at the end of the third-floor hallway, sealed off for as long as anyone could remember. The door was always locked, the windows covered in thick layers of dust. Students whispered about it in hushed tones, claiming it was haunted, though no one seemed to know why. One rainy afternoon, after staying late for an after-school project, my curiosity got the best of me. My friends had all gone home, and the school was eerily quiet. As I packed up my things, I realized I had left my notebook in the library. On my way back to get it, I wandered down the third-floor hallway, my footsteps echoing off the walls. The scene was so empty and scary. When I reached the end of the hall, there it was, room 217. The door looked like it hadn't been touched in years, the wood cracked and the brass handle tarnished. But to my surprise, as I approached, I heard a faint noise coming from inside, indistinct whispers. I stopped dead in my tracks, straining to hear more clearly. It was unmistakable. Someone or something was whispering behind that door. My pulse quickened as I stood there, unsure whether to leave or investigate. Against my better judgment, I reached for the doorknob, fully expecting it to be locked. It wasn't. The lock was completely rusted and no longer worked. The door creaked open with a low groan, revealing the dark, abandoned classroom inside. Desks were scattered haphazardly, chairs overturned, as if the room had been left in a hurry. Dust particles floated in the pale light that filtered through the dirty windows, and the air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. As I stepped inside, the whispering grew louder. It seemed to come from every corner of the room, though I couldn't make out any specific words. I scanned the room, but there was no one there. My heart raced, my hands trembling as I reached for the nearest desk, half expecting something to leap out at me. Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut with a deafening bang. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. I was locked in. The whispering grew frantic, almost angry, as if the unseen voices were arguing among themselves. My chest tightened with panic, and I backed away toward the windows, desperate to find a way out, but the windows wouldn't budge, sealed shut by years of grime and rust. Then I saw it. On the far side of the room, scrawled in jagged, uneven handwriting on the chalkboard, was a message: "Get out." The air grew colder, and the whispers intensified. They were louder now, furious, as if urging me to leave. But the door remained locked. My head spun, the pressure building in my ears. I was trapped. My legs felt like they were rooted to the floor, and fear gripped me like a vice. In a last desperate attempt, I ran to the door and yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers were deafening now, like a chorus of angry voices all speaking at once, filling the room with their fury. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, and every hair on my body stood on end.
Just when I thought I would pass out from fear, the door swung open with a violent force, and I stumbled out into the hallway. The whispering stopped instantly, leaving behind an oppressive silence. I didn't look back. I ran down the stairs, out of the building, and straight home without stopping. The next day, I told a teacher what had happened, hoping they would check the room. But when we returned to room 217, the door was locked once more, and the classroom looked undisturbed. No one believed my story. For the rest of the year, I avoided the third floor altogether. But even now, years later, I still hear the whispers in my nightmares. Something was in that room, something that wanted me gone, and I'll never forget the terror that filled my heart in the whispering classroom.
Night shift at the morgue. I worked as a security guard at a local hospital in the morgue area. The place often experienced break-ins by a few addicts trying to experiment with some strange chemicals stored in the lab, and eventually it became their final resting place. Everything started like a normal night shift. Hygiene plays a crucial role in the hospital. To keep the place more sanitary, they recently installed automatic sliding doors that open when someone passes by, eliminating the need to touch any door handles. Every night at exactly 3:00 a.m., the door would open for a few seconds and then close again. I believe the door was programmed with some kind of time-based trigger. But when I contacted the door installation company, they told me that was impossible since the door was designed to open only when the sensor was activated or manually operated. So, this continued without explanation for a long time and became a routine for everyone watching the door open and close on the monitor every night. Tonight, I was on shift alone because my colleague was sick, and there wasn't enough time to find a temporary replacement on such short notice. I was no stranger to danger and didn't worry about working alone at night. The security monitors showed only 2 cameras, one facing the control room and another at the far end of the hallway looking toward the morgue entrance. When the clock struck 3:00 a.m., I did what every night guard on duty would do. I started watching the screen. As usual, the door moved, but honestly, I still got chills sometimes from the sudden rush of cold air every time the door opened. Suddenly, the door remained open. I thought it was a screen glitch, but the lights on the door were still flashing. I waited a few minutes, but I soon realized I had to go down the hallway because the morgue door was strictly prohibited from being left open. As I walked down the hallway, the cold air blew against me, and I thought it would be even colder when I reached the morgue. I had hoped that the door might have closed by the time I got there, but just as I saw on the monitor, the door was indeed still open, and the camera was functioning normally. I tried waving my hand in front of the sensor, but it was useless. The door didn't budge. I reluctantly considered my next option, which was to check the sensors from the inside. As I turned around to look down the hallway, the door finally closed. I felt my hair stand on end as a strange quietness settled in a sensation like someone was standing right behind me. Out of curiosity, I went back to the monitor. I decided to rewind the security footage to the moment I approached the door to see if I could spot anything unusual. And what I saw was something I shouldn't have witnessed. There was a girl standing in front of the door behind me. I couldn't clearly see her face because of her long black hair and the white dress she was wearing. She just stood there smiling, staring at me with one eye. To this day, I still can't explain it, as I had just been there and hadn't seen anyone. It wasn't until I checked the other camera that faced the entrance to the control room that I truly shuddered, and I still have nightmares about it to this day. Due to a mysterious power surge, most of the data on the drive was completely corrupted. I stared at the blank screen, my mind reeling. The events of that night played over and over in my head, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still in the room, watching from the shadows. Every night, as I try to sleep, when the clock strikes 3:00 a.m., I can still feel the chill in the air, the weight of invisible eyes on my back, and the quiet whisper of the girl who is there. The Yin and Yang Train. The Midnight Express was a train shrouded in mystery and fear. It was said to appear only once a year, on a stormy night, traveling through the remote countryside. Legend had it that those who boarded the train never returned. As a journalist for a local newspaper, I had always been skeptical of such tales, but I couldn't resist the lure of a good story. This year, I decided to investigate. It was a dark and stormy night, fitting for the task at hand. I drove to the old, abandoned train station where the Midnight Express was rumored to appear. The station was in disrepair, with weeds growing through the cracks in the platform and broken windows staring like empty eyes. The air was thick with anticipation and the distant rumble of thunder. I set up my camera and waited, the rain pouring down relentlessly. Just as I was beginning to doubt the legend, a distant whistle pierced the night. My heart raced as I saw the faint glow of the train's headlight approaching. The Midnight Express emerged from the darkness, an old steam engine with an eerie, almost spectral appearance. The train slowed to a halt, its doors creaking open. Despite my fear, I boarded the train, determined to uncover the truth. The interior was surprisingly well preserved, with plush seats and dim, flickering lights. The air inside was cold, and an unsettling silence hung over everything. I took a seat and prepared my notebook and camera, ready to document whatever I encountered. As the train began to move, I noticed that I was not alone. A few other passengers were scattered throughout the train, all of them staring straight ahead, their faces devoid of emotion. I tried to strike up a conversation with the man sitting across from me, but he remained silent, his eyes empty and hollow. A shiver ran down my spine. The train moved through the night, the storm raging outside. I decided to explore the other cars, hoping to find someone willing to talk. As I walked through the train, I noticed the passengers all had the same vacant expressions. They seemed more like mannequins than living people. My unease grew with each step. In the last car, I found a conductor. He was an old man with a weathered face and piercing eyes that seemed to see right through me.
Can I help you?
He asked, his voice gravelly and cold. I told him I was a journalist investigating the Midnight Express and asked about the passengers.
They are souls trapped between this world and the next. This train is their purgatory, a place where they must confront their past sins before moving on.
I felt a chill as I realized the gravity of his words. Why am I here? I asked. The conductor's eyes darkened.
You sought the truth, and now you are part of it. You must face your own demons before you can leave.
Panic set in as I tried to leave the car, but the door wouldn't budge. The train began to feel like a prison, the walls closing in on me. I ran back to my seat, hoping to find some way out. The passengers' faces seemed to contort into grotesque masks, their eyes following my every move. Desperate, I looked out the window, but the landscape had changed. Instead of the familiar countryside, I saw scenes from my own life, moments of regret, guilt, and pain. The train was forcing me to confront my own past. As the storm outside intensified, so did my memories. I realized I had spent my life running from my mistakes, never facing the consequences of my actions. The train slowed to a stop, and the conductor appeared again.
It's time,
he said. With a deep breath, I stepped off the train and into the unknown, ready to confront my past and seek redemption. The Midnight Express disappeared into the night, leaving me alone on the platform, but no longer afraid. I had found my story, and it was one that I would carry with me forever. The Mysterious Camp. I am a camping enthusiast. On this 2-day trip to the forest near my home, I went camping with my longtime companion Ring, the dog that has been with me for a long time. But I realized I was not as alone as I thought. It was in November. The daytime weather was quite warm, but it was quite cold at night. As always, I brought all the camping gear I had. Since it was close to the lake, I also brought a fishing rod to fish. I arrived and set up camp in a comfortable clearing near the lake to fish. While fishing, Ring kept looking into the forest, and his tail was wagging as if he had discovered something. I thought it was probably some small animals that he saw or heard. Ring is very well trained and will not run off without my command. After about an hour of fishing, we walked around the lake. On the other side of the lake, I saw a few people walking into the forest. They were too far away to be sure, but they really looked like humans. We quickly returned to the camp. When I got back to the camp, I saw the tent zipper was open. Someone had entered my tent, but nothing was missing. Not that there was much to take besides the campfire and fishing gear. But I knew I was right. They were a group of people. The thought of them sneaking into my tent without permission made me quite creepy. To be safe, I spent the next hour moving my camp to a different location further down the lake. Then I started chopping wood to light a fire. When the fire was burning, I fed Ring and then warmed up the food for dinner. Ring continued barking into the forest. By then, it was dark, and I couldn't see anything except the firelight. I looked into the darkness with a sense of fear. With that thought, I brought Ring into the tent and extinguished the fire. I crawled into my sleeping bag, and with the reading light beside me, I was reading my novel. Ring's ears kept twitching as he heard things that I couldn't hear. He kept looking around and started growling. I imagined someone out there in the darkness, scarier than a bear. Eventually, Ring calmed down and put his head down. I felt uneasy and wanted the night to pass quickly, so I turned off the light and went to sleep. I woke up a few hours later to the sound of growling and howling. I told Ring to be quiet. I listened and heard someone whistling, the kind of whistle you do to get a dog's attention. Someone was really out there at my camp in the thick darkness, and I was terrified. Then there were footsteps coming closer to the tent until they were right outside and then stopped. Ring howled madly, and I held him tight to keep him quiet without saying anything. There was no crackling fire, just absolute silence except for the wind. Looking towards the tent's zipper, I tried to deepen my voice and commanded and shouted, "You'd better get out of here, don't come any closer," then threatened them with my emergency flare gun. The footsteps moved away from the tent, slow and heavy. I couldn't sleep after that, but I was too scared to leave the tent and pack up in the dark. Then from a distance, the scream of a woman echoed for miles. It sounded like a woman really screaming for her life. That was the last straw. I grabbed my life quickly, put on my shoes, grabbed a flashlight, and ran. I sprinted until I reached my truck. I slept in the truck that night, and at dawn, I went back to the forest with Ring to pack up the camp. I didn't even check to see if my stuff had been rummaged through. I just hurried to get out of there. As soon as I had signal, I called the non-emergency police number I found online to report the scream and the suspicious people around my camp the night before. I don't know what happened after that and don't know what is going on in that forest, but I never went camping there again. Luckily for me, it was a memorable camping trip. Mysterious driver in the desert. Gavi was driving down an empty desert highway, stretching for miles, barren and silent. He had been driving for hours. The only sound was the crackling of his car's radio, which seemed to be breaking down, with only static and the occasional country tune. This was one of the rare times Gavi passed through here. He glanced at his dashboard map. No towns, no gas stations for miles. Just an empty, desolate road. As Gavi approached a small hill on the road, he felt a sense of relief. The slight slope broke the endless flatness, providing a brief change. But as he went downhill, something caught his attention in the distance. At first, he couldn't tell what it was. Just a shape, a dark figure faintly illuminated by the moonlight. But as he got closer, the figure took form a person standing on the side of the road. Gavi slowed down, squinting to get a better look. It was a woman, standing alone in the middle of nowhere. She wore a long white dress and had pale skin. Her long black hair hung over her face as if soaked in water. Gavi muttered, wondering what she was doing out here. There was nothing for miles. No cars, no houses. How did she even get here? Gavi slowed the car further, considering whether to stop. Maybe she was lost. But as he got closer, something sent a chill down his spine. Her hair looked too wet, as if she had just walked out of a rainstorm, even though the desert had been dry for weeks. And her face, what little he could see of it, her eyes were too large, unblinking, staring straight at Gavi through the wet strands of hair. He hit the gas, speeding past her in fear. Even though he tried to convince himself she was just a lost traveler or perhaps a prank, Gavi couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Minutes passed, and Gavi continued driving through the endless desert, the eerie calm returning. He kept glancing in the rear-view mirror, feeling as if someone was watching him. He shook his head, trying to stay focused, but then Gavi saw another hill in the distance, just like the one he had passed earlier. And after a short drive, there she was again. The same woman, the same white dress, the same wet hair covering her face. But this time, she was closer to the road, and her smile was even wider, more unnatural. Gavi couldn't believe his eyes. How could she have gotten here before him? There was no way she could have moved that fast. He didn't think twice and slammed his foot on the gas, speeding forward to get past her. This time, Gavi didn't dare look back. Another hill appeared ahead, and the familiar fear tightened in Gavi's chest. He didn't want to go over it, didn't want to see her again, but he had no choice. His worst fear came true. She was there again, standing and waving at him. Her smile now impossibly wide, stretching nearly from ear to ear, and her cold, soulless eyes stared directly at Gavi. Maybe she was some sort of hallucination conjured by his imagination. No matter how much he tried, the fear continued to gnaw at him. He had heard the stories of haunted highways, of strange ghosts appearing to night travelers, but he had never believed them until now. He couldn't keep driving and needed to stop to escape this cursed road. But there was no exit, no rest stop. Gavi felt trapped with no way out. And then, the radio started crackling again. He reached out with a trembling hand to adjust the dial. But before he could turn it off, Gavi felt something cold touch the back of his neck. He froze. Reaching from behind the driver's seat was a pair of pale white hands. The fingers wrapped around his face, slowly digging their nails into his skin. Gavi was now about to face something he didn't understand, and he still had a secret he was hiding. Mysterious driver in the desert. Those fingers, they were slowly tightening around Gavi's face. They were icy cold. Cold like the touch of death itself. He was frozen in place. Slowly, with fear creeping down his spine, he turned to look. Gavi couldn't see the face those hands belonged to, but he had the sense it was a woman. Was it the woman? The one he'd passed many times on the highway? His mind was flooded with horror. The car swerved violently as the grip on him tightened. The tires screeched against the road. The car was losing control. The car veered off the highway, crashing into the rocky terrain with a sharp, grating sound. The impact was brutal, throwing him against the steering wheel as the airbag deployed. Pain surged through his body. Gavi's head hit the window, and for a moment, everything seemed to blur. Smoke rose from the crumpled hood, the headlights flickering dimly on the dark horizon. Gavi's vision swam as he tried to focus. He was still alive. Gavi could feel blood trickling down one side of his face. His limbs were heavy, weighed down. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. Then, he blacked out. In the distance, a car approached. The officer, a seasoned man who had seen his share of accidents, stepped out of his vehicle, his flashlight cutting through the desert's dark night. The car was a wreck. Twisted metal and shattered glass scattered across the rocky ground. Smoke still rose from the engine. The officer cautiously approached. The officer, Jay, shone his flashlight through the driver's side window. His eyes widened in shock when he saw the body still strapped into the seatbelt. After checking the license plate, he realized it was someone named Gavi. His head was twisted at a strange angle, almost wrenched to the side, and his eyes wouldn't close, wide open as if staring right at me. His face frozen in a horrifying grimace, blood smeared across his skin. But just as Jay started to step back, he heard something. A sound like someone crying, but it was muffled, as if something was blocking their mouth. The sound came from the trunk. At first, it was faint, barely audible. But as Jay leaned in to investigate, it grew louder, more desperate. It was a sobbing, painful cry, like that of a child trapped inside. Panic surged through the officer as he ran to the back of the car. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the trunk latch. Jay's mind raced with questions. Who could be inside? What had happened? 2 cases at once? The trunk lid sprang open. Jay's flashlight illuminated a haunting sight inside the cramped trunk, a little girl. A young girl, bound and gagged. Her wrists and ankles were tied tightly with thick, rough rope, and her mouth was sealed with tape. Tears streamed down her pale face, her eyes wide with fear. Not just that clutched tightly to her chest was a doll. The doll wore a white dress, its skin pale and cracked with age, its face fixed in a disturbingly wide smile. Large, dark eyes stared back, and its long black hair appeared wet, hanging loose. Jay reached out to touch the doll, and then its head moved. The girl sobbed, her body trembling as she clung to the doll. Jay staggered back, the weight of the doll's gaze pressing on him. He turned away, his breath becoming ragged, his heart pounding in his chest. The officer fought back his rising panic. It was just a coincidence, he told himself. He quickly untied the girl and removed the tape from her mouth. She gasped for air, sobbing loudly. Jay reassured the girl and led her to his patrol car. He called for backup. From the moment they got into the car, the doll sat there, staring at him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching him, studying him with its eerie and unsettling gaze. Soon after, backup and paramedics arrived. The girl was taken to the hospital, still clutching the doll, which baffled him. Her small hands clung to it as if it were the only thing tethering her. As the ambulance drove away, Jay remained haunted by the strange presence of the doll. He pondered the mysterious events leading up to the crash. Even though the girl had been rescued, the story felt far from over. It seemed to have slipped beyond Jay's understanding, perhaps into another world entirely. The Clown in the Tree. This happened to me when I was 14. It was the same year everyone was talking about creepy clowns lurking in random places. The stories were everywhere, but I never took them seriously until I had an encounter of my own. I was sitting alone in the living room. My parents had gone to my grandparents' house for the evening, leaving me home by myself. But instead of feeling free, there was a strange unease I couldn't shake. I texted some friends, inviting them over to kill time John and Emma. We played video games for a while, but after a few hours, we got bored. John had an idea. He said, "Let's go into the woods." There was a forest right behind my house that we usually avoided, especially at night. But it was still light out, and with nothing else to do, I agreed. We gathered ourselves and headed out. Part of me regretted it as soon as we left the house. The forest was dense, tall trees casting cool shade, but we weren't scared. We joked around, tossed sticks, and laughed about nothing. We had been there for about 20 or 30 minutes when we heard something strange. Someone was crying. The sound was faint but unmistakable, like sobbing, desperate, coming from deep within the trees. We all stopped, staring at each other. John was the first to break the silence, whispering tensely, "What the hell is that?" None of us knew, and Emma suggested we go check it out. I wanted to say no, but before I could, everyone was already heading towards the sound. My heart started pounding harder with each step. Something felt wrong, like we were walking into a place we shouldn't. As we got closer, we saw a figure slumped on a large branch of an old tree. It was a man, dressed as a clown. His outfit was white with black polka dots, but it was stained and torn. He wore a black wig, but it was messy, and his makeup was smeared by what looked like tears. He just sat there, quietly crying. John, being the idiot he was, yelled, "Hey, you idiot! Why are you crying up there?" A chill ran down my spine, and I instantly turned to John, telling him to shut up. But it was too late. The clown looked down at us, his tear-streaked face twisting into a smile. His lips curled upward, but it was hollow, as if he was trying to express something through invisible pain. And then I saw it, his hand, gripping a large machete, the blade covered in what looked like blood. We were frozen. He just sat there, staring at us, his smile widening grotesquely, yet his eyes were cold, emotionless. He said, "You won't understand, but when I show you, you will." Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I screamed, "Run!" We scattered, running in all directions. My heart pounded, my feet barely touching the ground as I sprinted towards home. The forest seemed endless, branches scratching at my skin as I ran. I could hear the others screaming, their voices fading as we were separated. I reached the edge of the woods, sprinting into my backyard. I didn't stop until I was inside, slamming the door behind me. Then, I waited for my friends. Emma made it back, panting and pale with fear. But John wasn't with us. We waited for him, hoping he'd burst through the door, laughing about how scared we were. But then we waited, and no one came. We called the police. They came and searched the forest. We told them everything: the clown, the machete, the crying. They didn't seem surprised. It turned out the man we saw was a local. He had been on the run for days. The police said he was a heavy drug user who had killed his wife and left her body wrapped in a white sheet. The next day, they found John. He was dead, discovered in a deep lake in the forest. The man must have chased him while the rest of us ran. I couldn't believe it. John was gone, just like that. And it was my fault for agreeing to go into that forest. If I hadn't, maybe he would still be alive. I told my parents everything, and they promised never to leave me home alone again. But it didn't help much. I couldn't sleep for weeks, and when I did, I had nightmares of the clown standing in the forest, smiling at me with his blood-stained machete. It's been 5 years since that night. I'm 19 now, but the memory of what happened in the forest is still burned into my mind. John's disappearance and the discovery of his body in the lake. It haunts me. No one ever talked about it after the police closed the case. A tragic accident, they said. A drug-crazed maniac. But I knew there was more to it. For years, I pushed the memories down, but recently, they've started to resurface. It began with nightmares, the image of the clown, his twisted smile. But lately, it's been more real, as if he's not just in my dreams anymore. Something is coming for me. I've started feeling like I'm being watched again, just like back then. And tonight, I swear I saw him, standing at the edge of the forest behind my house, staring at me. I grabbed a flashlight, pepper spray, and a taser. I don't even know what I was thinking, but I couldn't sit here, paralyzed by fear anymore. The only way to end this is to go back to where it all started. The air was thick with silence as I stepped outside, the flashlight casting weak beams through the trees. The moment I entered the forest, each step felt heavier than the last, as if the woods themselves were pulling me deeper into the darkness. I didn't know where I was going, but my legs seemed to remember the way. Soon enough, I found myself back at the place where we had first seen the clown crying. Suddenly, the rustling of leaves shattered the silence. I froze. The sound of snapping twigs grew closer. I slowly turned around. The flashlight shook in my trembling hands, illuminating a figure perched on a branch, whistling. It was him. He looked just like before, his white clothes smeared with dirt and something darker dried blood. His black wig was still a tangled mess. He just sat there, staring, holding the machete. The clown tilted his head, his smile twisting even more as he jumped down effortlessly, walking slowly, deliberately toward me. He said, "Welcome back." I was so angry I almost cried, yelling that I knew what he had done to John. The clown's smile faded, replaced by a fake look of pity. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I didn't kill him. He chose it." I shook my head, backing away. His words. When I ran, I remembered seeing John hesitate, standing still. He didn't seem scared, more like mesmerized. And what he said before we ran into the woods, he looks sad, doesn't he? I snapped back to reality as the clown got closer, saying that when it was my turn, I'd understand. His words hit me like a punch. I stumbled backward, tripping over a fallen branch. The flashlight slipped from my hand, flickering as it rolled across the ground. Darkness enveloped me, and I reached to grab it, but the clown's footsteps were closer now. I looked up and saw him towering over me, raising the machete. I pulled the pepper spray from my pocket and sprayed it. He staggered for a moment. But then I heard a voice that sounded like John's. "Alex, you need to leave. I don't know how." I didn't look back at the clown. I just ran. His laughter echoed behind me. Suddenly, I was standing in my backyard, alone. The forest was quiet now, the house dark and still. I rushed inside and called the police, convinced he was still out there. When the police arrived this time, he was there. They found him crouched near the lake, clutching the machete. His clothes were soaked in blood and dirt. He didn't resist when they approached. Later, they interrogated him for hours. The clown believed he was chosen to lead people to the other side. The police dismissed it as the ramblings of a madman. But even then, I knew something darker was at play. Underground parking and mysterious people. I worked the night shift at an apartment complex downtown. The job seemed simple enough: monitor cameras, patrol, and ensure the building's security. The building was constructed in the late 60s, and its design left many vulnerable entry points in the parking garage. The association was concerned about security, especially with the occasional break-ins and homeless people finding shelter in the hidden corners of the basement. I had worked here for months, and every night I would check every nook and cranny. Most nights were quiet, normal, even boring. Until tonight. I walked through the dimly lit parking garage, my footsteps echoing. The place was a maze of dead spaces and blind spots. Too many places to hide. Too many areas the cameras couldn't see. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing only parked cars and empty spaces. I always hated the door that led to a dead-end hallway. It was an isolated corridor that led nowhere. Just a locked door that couldn't be opened from the inside, as if it held some history better left unknown. As I approached the door, it was wide open. A cold wave of fear washed over me. The door was supposed to be locked tight. I swept my flashlight down the narrow hallway. There was nothing, just an empty glass bottle lying on the ground. My anxiety spiked. The thought of stepping into the hallway made me uneasy. I didn't want to get trapped in there, especially knowing the door locked from the outside. But procedure is procedure. I had to follow it, and I couldn't just leave the bottle there. Reluctantly, I stepped inside. I moved toward the bottle, my flashlight reflecting off the cold gray walls. Each step felt heavier than the last. I bent down, picked up the bottle, and stood up. But then, the sound that chilled me to the bone, the door slammed shut behind me. I rushed to the door, panic rising in my chest, and grabbed the handle. It was locked. I pounded on the metal door, screaming for help, but the thick concrete walls swallowed my cries. My heart raced as I realized no one was coming. It was 3 a.m., and I was trapped. I tried my phone, no signal. The thick walls and metal door blocked everything. I was completely cut off from the outside world. I leaned against the cold wall, trying to calm myself down. The flashlight was my only lifeline in the stifling darkness. I switched it off to save the battery, but I could still hear echoes from somewhere. Then the sound of car alarms blared, one after the other. Whoever had locked me in was out there, doing whatever they wanted, smashing car doors, stealing whatever they could. After what felt like hours, I heard footsteps. It was a miracle. Someone was out there, and I had to make them hear me. I pounded on the door with all my strength, shouting loudly. Finally, a deep, raspy voice answered from the other side, and after a moment, the lock clicked. The door opened, and I felt a wave of relief. A passerby, on their way to work early, had heard my banging. I thanked them profusely as I stumbled out of the hallway, my legs shaking, but my relief didn't last long. As I returned to the basement, chaos greeted me. Windows were shattered, glass littered the concrete floor. At least a dozen cars had been broken into, valuable items stolen. Whoever locked me in knew exactly what they were doing. They had silenced the alarms after each car was hit, leaving behind damage worth tens of thousands of dollars. My heart sank. I knew what was coming next. When the morning shift arrived and the residents discovered the theft, the police would be called, and I would be fired. Security had been breached under my watch, and though it wasn't my fault, I was the one held responsible. Weeks later, after I had quit, the mystery still haunted me. I replayed the events of that night over and over in my head. How did they know exactly where to trap me? How did they avoid the cameras so perfectly? No one was ever caught. The footage showed nothing, just me, doing my rounds. As I walked, I didn't see a thing. Maybe they knew the blind spots of the place too well. Months had passed, but tonight, that phone call pulled me back to the core of everything. I walked into the parking garage. I approached the dead-end hallway, my heart pounding harder with every step. The door was ajar. Just like that night, I could feel the weight of the past pressing on me, daring me to confront it. There was something I missed before. I stood at the entrance, staring, then cautiously moved forward as my senses sharpened. This time, I was ready for whatever I might face. No more running. Then I saw him. It was probably the man who trapped me. His gaunt face was pale and dirty, his hollow eyes fixed on me. He stood still, almost like a statue, as if he had been waiting for me all this time. A chill ran down my spine. The man wasn't a ghost or a specter, he was real. My voice trembled as I spoke. "Who are you? Why did you do this?" The man didn't move at first, but then, slowly, a twisted smile spread across his face, growing wider. He started walking toward me. He started saying something I didn't understand, talking about how I would soon see for myself the secret of this place, the truth I had been afraid of and running from. He said he wasn't just some random drifter that night, and that he had been here much longer than I thought. This building, this place, it wasn't just concrete and steel. It was a prison, and people like him, they were trapped inside. For a moment, his expression darkened. He told me that there are things in this world that feed on fear and suffering. And places like this, they are where they hunt. Now, he was part of its cycle. My mind raced as I tried to understand what he was saying. The truth hit me, and I realized this man wasn't just some random criminal. He was a victim of something much darker, something that had taken hold of him and was now trying to take me too. I stepped back, my heart pounding. "I'm not like you. I can still get out of this." His smile widened again, sinister and mocking. I turned, glancing at the door, thinking about running. I clenched my fists, took one last look at the man, then turned and sprinted toward the door. I could hear his laughter echoing behind me, filling the narrow hallway. I ran through the parking garage, then stopped. Standing there, in the darkness, was another figure, identical to the man in the hallway. I froze. This couldn't be happening. More figures appeared, stepping out from the shadows. Each one looked just like him, pale, gaunt. Maybe they weren't real, but they felt so real, their malicious energy surrounding me. I staggered. That man hadn't been lying. This place, this building, it was still alive. It had taken him, just as it had taken others before him. and now it was my turn. But I wasn't going to let that happen. With one last surge of strength, I got up and ran, not stopping until I was far away from the building, the figures fading into the night behind me. I didn't look back. Safe in my apartment, I sat in the dark, the truth of that night still sinking in. The man, the building. I had escaped, but deep down I knew it wouldn't be that simple. I needed to stay far away from that place and never go back. Scary night at the toy store. The night sky was heavy, and the large parking lot outside a quiet toy store was dimly lit by a few sparse streetlights. The store was about to close, and Sana, a woman in her 30s, walked toward the entrance. She held a list tightly in her hand. Her daughter's 6th birthday was coming up soon. Inside, the store was nearly empty. Sana walked past shelves filled with toys. She felt excited as she picked up stuffed animals and birthday decorations. As she walked, she had the unsettling feeling that someone was watching her. She glanced over and saw a man at the end of the aisle. He wore a long black coat and had a hat pulled low over his face. He just stood there, staring at her. Sana immediately looked away, pretending not to notice, but she could feel his eyes burning into her. She grabbed the last item on her list and moved to a different aisle, hoping to shake the strange and uneasy feeling. For the next 15 minutes, she tried to continue shopping, moving through different parts of the store. She hurried through checkout, her nerves on edge. After paying, she headed for the exit. The parking lot was almost empty, except for her car and a suspicious gray SUV parked nearby. The vast emptiness made the SUV's proximity unsettling. As she neared her car, Sana's heart raced when she heard a car door open from the other side of the SUV. The man in the black coat emerged from around the SUV. It was the same man from the store. Her fear began to rise as she recognized him. She thought she needed to hide for a while. Sana hurried inside, her breath quickening. The store was nearly empty now, and the isolation was overwhelming. She moved through the aisles, trying to lose the man in the maze of shelves. Every few minutes, she glanced over her shoulder. The man was there, trailing her through the store. He kept his distance but never let her out of his sight. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. She quickly dialed her husband, and when he answered, she whispered urgently into the phone. He promised he would be there in less than 10 minutes. The minutes felt like hours as she moved around the store, pretending to browse but always keeping an eye on the man. At one point, he seemed to lose interest and walked toward the exit, but as Sana neared the checkout counter, he lined up right behind her. The air felt stifling. She quickly moved through rows of stuffed animals and dolls, praying that the man wouldn't see her anymore. She crouched behind a shelf, pressing her back against it. She looked around, but didn't see him anywhere. For a moment, she dared to hope that he had really left. But then, the soft sound of footsteps on the floor shattered her illusion of safety. He rounded the corner, his figure looming larger as he got closer. Sana's back pressed against the shelf, and a row of dolls wobbled. She flinched in fear as one of them fell to the ground with a soft thud. The man stopped just a few feet away. She glanced, her eyes alert, watching his every move. This close, she could make out more details. His gloved hands, the lower part of his face visible beneath the brim of his hat. A faint, crooked smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He took another step toward her. He reached into his coat, and for a moment, Sana's heart stopped. Was he pulling out a weapon? What was he about to do? Suddenly, headlights swept across the parking lot as a car pulled in. Sana's husband had arrived, and his car stopped right in front of the toy store. The man glanced toward the lights, his expression stiffening, growing cautious. He stepped back into the shadows as Sana's husband drew closer. Sana saw her husband get out of the car. He walked toward the store, his eyes scanning the parking lot for her. She seized the moment and ran past the man, her heart pounding as she sprinted toward the store entrance. She didn't look back, but she could feel his eyes burning into her as she escaped. Sana rushed through the front door of the store, running toward her husband. Her face was pale, and her hands were trembling, but she was safe. She collapsed into his arms, her breath coming in gasps as the fear that had overwhelmed her began to fade. Her husband looked past her, scanning the store for the man, but the parking lot had returned to its eerie calm. The man in the black coat had disappeared, melting into the shadows. Her husband gripped the steering wheel, ready to drive them home, but Sana couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Later that night, Sana's phone rang. It was a call from the local police station. The man had been caught. They wanted her to come in and give a statement. The man had been arrested just hours after leaving the parking lot. A patrol car had spotted his SUV parked suspiciously in another lot near a shopping mall. When the police approached him casually, he resisted arrest, acting erratically. Sana listened intently as the detective began revealing disturbing details that had come to light after his arrest. During questioning, the man, identified as Dennis, initially refused to cooperate. He claimed he was just shopping late and looking for lost car keys, but his story quickly unraveled. The police found disturbing evidence inside his SUV, items that made Sana's skin crawl. First, there was a knife, wrapped in cloth and hidden under the passenger seat. It wasn't an ordinary knife. The blade was worn, and the handle was smooth from years of use. Next to it was a set of duct tape, rope, and zip ties, all stashed in a small canvas bag. Dennis had likely planned something far worse than just following her. The real horror came when they found the photos. Many were of women, all taken from a distance, some in grocery stores, others as they left malls, a few while walking their dogs. And then Sana's breath caught in her throat. Scattered among the pictures were photos of her, some from the toy store that night, and many others taken before. They were taken when she dropped her daughter off at school, when she went grocery shopping, and even when she left her apartment. Realizing Dennis had been following her for days, maybe weeks, made her feel sick. As the investigation continued, more terrifying truths about Dennis emerged. He often stalked women, but none of his victims had ever filed charges. He was disturbingly careful, always skirting the edges of the law, always evading arrest or detection. 2 years earlier, in another town, Dennis had been investigated for the disappearance of a woman, though no evidence was ever found. The case had since gone cold. Sana was horrified to realize she could have easily become another cold case, another missing person, if her husband hadn't arrived in time that night. The police assured her Dennis would be locked up and no longer a threat. Sana and her husband left the police station. They drove home in the quiet darkness. She glanced over at her husband, grateful that he had arrived just in time. But deep down, a new sense of caution had been born. She would never let her guard down like that again. Run away from strangers. The grocery store sat in the middle of a vast, empty parking lot, bathed in the faint glow of streetlights. It was 2 a.m. The store was closed, and the eerie quiet surrounded it. The night was still, until a soft tapping on the glass echoed in the darkness. I was the night shift manager here. Usually, things were calm, and nothing happened. It was just me, stocking shelves during the quiet hours while the outside world slept. I had been working non-stop since my shift began at 10 p.m., trying to get everything done. My focus was broken when I heard the faint tapping. It was coming from the front of the store. I left my cart and headed toward the sound. Through the large glass windows, I saw him, a man. He was leaning against the glass, trying to peer inside. His clothes were tattered, his face expressionless, with a hollow, vacant look in his eyes. He saw me the moment I came into view. I approached the glass door. I asked him what he wanted. He demanded I open the door. His face was emotionless. No hint of a smile, just cold eyes staring at me. I told him the store was closed and that he couldn't be here. As I turned to walk away, a loud bang startled me. The man's fists were pounding on the glass, over and over, each strike louder and angrier than the last. My heart raced. This guy wasn't just a harmless drifter. I pulled out my phone, showing him I was ready to call the police. Only then did he back off, his eyes still locked on me, filled with rage. Slowly, he stepped back into the shadows of the parking lot. The tension in me eased slightly. He was gone. I put my phone away and tried to focus back on my work. 15 minutes passed. The tapping, the pounding, the man, all of it faded from my mind as I immersed myself in stocking the shelves. But then I heard it, the sound of metal breaking, like something being torn apart. I abandoned the stroller and ran forward, fear rising. My heart sank when I saw the glass door slightly open. The lock, the only thing that kept the door secure, was missing. Fear gripped me as I realized what this meant. I need to go to the office, call the police now. I turned to run for the office, but I froze in place. Standing not far from me, blocking my path, was the man. His expression hadn't changed, still cold, still lifeless, filled with rage. I don't think anything. I just run. I burst through the door, the man right behind me. Suddenly, a beat-up van screeched into view, speeding toward the front of the store. It swerved dangerously, nearly hitting me as it stopped, my heart pounding in my chest. I moved forward, running past the van, but then everything flipped upside down. A sharp pain suddenly exploded at the back of my head. My body lurched forward as I fell to the ground. I didn't even have time to process what had happened before the world started fading. I felt hands grabbing me, roughly lifting me off the cold pavement. My vision blurred, darkness closing in, and the last thing I remembered was the roar of the van's engine and the sensation of being dragged inside. I woke up with a throbbing headache, my wrists tightly bound behind me. The van bounced and swayed as it sped down an unfamiliar road. My mind was foggy, disoriented. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then it all came rushing back. I started to string it together. Man, the truck. Perhaps I was kidnapped by him. My heart raced as I realized I needed to act, and fast. I glanced around. Inside, it was pitch black, but I could make out a pile of old tools, a rusted toolbox, and some scattered metal pieces on the floor. I twisted my wrists, testing the ropes. They were tight, but I could feel a slight give, just enough to give me hope. I could hear the driver muttering to himself up front. His voice was low, angry. This wasn't over. I took a deep breath, calming the panic rising inside me. I needed to think, and I needed to get out. I inched closer to the toolbox, my fingers searching for anything sharp. It was hard, but I found a small, jagged piece of rusted metal. I awkwardly twisted my hands, rubbing the metal against the ropes. My heart pounded with every noise the van made, every bump in the road that might expose me, each one painful enough to make me want to scream. Suddenly, I felt the ropes loosen. A few more scratches and they snapped. My wrists were free, but I couldn't move too quickly. I glanced toward the front seat, where I could see the back of the driver's head. He hadn't realized I was awake yet. I noticed the door latch wasn't locked. I needed a plan. The van slowed as it made a sharp turn onto a dirt road. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Taking a deep breath, I yanked the back door open and jumped into the night. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my body as I tumbled over dirt and gravel. For a second, I thought I wouldn't be able to move, but adrenaline surged through me. I staggered to my feet, running into the thick darkness of the trees. Behind me, the van screeched to a stop. I heard the man shouting, his footsteps pounding as he chased after me, but I didn't look back. I just kept running, my heart hammering in my chest. The trees, the branches, scratched at my skin as I tore through the dense underbrush. My mind was foggy, teetering between fear and survival. I could hear the man crashing through the forest behind me, his breath heavy and furious. I couldn't let him catch me again. Ahead, I spotted a clearing and the faint glow of lights through the trees. A road. If I could get there fast, I'd be safe. I burst out of the woods and onto the road, waving my arms frantically as a car approached. The headlights blinded me, but I didn't care. I needed help. I ran into the middle of the road, screaming for them to stop. The car screeched to a halt, and I collapsed against the hood, gasping for breath. The driver jumped out, shouting something, but I was too exhausted to answer. All I could do was whisper, "Help me." The driver pulled out his phone, calling the police. I glanced back at the man. He stood at the edge of the woods, staring at me with cold, furious eyes. But he didn't come any closer. He knew it was over. The flashing lights of police cars lit up the dark road. Officers surrounded the van. The man already in handcuffs not far away. His face was cold, blank, disturbingly empty. I sat on the curb, still trembling, wrapped in a blanket the police had given me. The world felt strange, like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. But I was grateful, lucky to be alive. I was free. The police assured me that he'd be locked away, that he wouldn't hurt anyone else. But the thought still lingered in my mind. What if I hadn't escaped? What if I hadn't been fast enough? As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I stood by the car, watching the police take the man away. The fear was still there, clinging to the edges of my mind, but I knew I had survived. I had been lucky to survive the night shift,